This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack.
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 45. I am your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we're
January
recording
20th.
This on a day of reckoning. Yes.
Yeah.
And as
Yeah.
of 6 o'clock Eastern time, no special operators have have fast rope descended from Navy choppers in the middle of Joe Biden's inaugural speech and arrested him for being an agent of the CCP. So I guess the globalists have won, and
this is unfortunately a normal podcast and not an emergency broadcast on all channels worldwide, interrupting everyone's phone calls and YouTube or whatever to broadcast an address from Trump. Declaring that the cabal has been defeated at the 11th hour.
It's really, it's a shame.
Yeah.
But this is episode 45, and I guess
as we say goodbye to 45,
he who shall not be named.
Yeah,
exactly. TR asterisk MP. He's gone.
The Orange Menace, the Mango Mussolini himself, the Tangerine Terror,
the High C Hitler.
No.
I just gotta get those out.
You know what? I just
out.
realized that we actually do kind of have a whole repertoire of bungler type names for Trump. Like the same way there is bungler, Muslim. Asshole,
traitor.
Oh, traitor. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, dumbass.
Butt munch.
We did get some good ones out of it. But I mean, I guess it's somewhat apropos because today we're gonna dive. We're gonna pick up on our Contra series, but pretty much all the other installments in the Contra series, this centers heavily around presidential executive power and things that were done in the White House, in the room where it happened.
Yes.
And,
I heard that several Hamilton references were worked into the inaugural poem today, just to reset the tone for the country. We're back on track.
It's beautiful. We're building back better. And and we made it, I guess we're going to make it out of our dark winter, unlike another superpower nation that did not make it out of its dark winter, which is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and basically the main topic of the book that we're going to be doing a deep analysis of today, which we mentioned before in a bunch of different episodes. It's like an interesting window into the Reagan-Bush milieu of the 1980s and the final years of the Soviet Union, and that is Peter Schweizer's Victory, which I think came out in 1994. And we've talked about Schweizer before a little bit. He is and I don't think this is a coincidence, he is the William J. Casey Fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University.
Cool.
Pretty cool. And I think title. he kind of probably made his bones probably this book that he wrote in 1994 probably went a long way towards him getting that vaunted title, because the main protagonist of it really is William J. Casey, Ronald Reagan's CIA director.
Yeah, there's no one who has done more to hold that chair than Peter Schweizer in this book. It really is all about, the main character is definitely Bill Casey.
Yeah. And, even though this book is, like, relatively obscure, we'll get into, like, it's popped up again in a few ways. It's like, it's almost like Christopher Lash for MAGA people, like a little bit. It's like, whoa, like this guy wrote this back in, like, the early 90s, but, like, it explains, like, certain people in the Trump administration found this book and wanted to apply the sort of the lessons and the strategies and tactics that are described therein towards its policy towards Iran over the last couple years. But basically, like, most people are probably more aware of Peter Schweizer he's a pretty regular face on Fox News. I think he goes on Tucker Carlson all the time. And he made a little bit of a splash, I think, back in 2016 with his book Clinton Cash, which, exposed all the shady financial dealings of the Clintons. And he's written a few kind of like expose, like kind of muckraking books in more recent years, usually focused on the demon rats and the Clintons and people of that nature. And so this book kind of like, it went out of print, and, he doesn't really talk about it much anymore. And it kind of just kind of like faded away from the historical conversation. But I think it's interesting. I stumbled on this book like years ago when I think I first read about like Project Hammer in the sort of 9/11 conspiracy world. And, which was supposedly a secret like financial kind of sabotage operation that was masterminded mainly by President George H.W. Bush and some other people like Alan Greenspan in the very late 80s, early 90s to like bankrupt the Soviet treasury and like bring down the entire Soviet bloc and like bust out their economy, like the mobsters that they are. And I think when I was like searching for Project Hammer, somehow in the search this book popped up, and it was kind of the close. And if you look at the cover of it, it sounds tantalizingly relevant. It says the Reagan administration's secret strategy that hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I got, oh, interesting.
I like Hastened is doing a lot of work there. You might
it really
say,
is.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting because I actually it's weird to kind of know or could kind of think about how the collapse of the Soviet Union is seen differently in different circles. Like, I think that generally, like, people of, as you mentioned, like, there was definitely, like, a moment for this book in the Trump administration vis-a-vis Iran. Like, Pompeo, was big into it and wanted to apply the lessons there to collapsing the Iranian, the Islamic Republic. But it's interesting because, generally in those circles, they kind of would cleave to the idea that the Soviet Union was destined to collapse, I guess,
Yes.
and that because, like, the underlying ideology was, like, a rotten attack on, the values of country or whatever, of all.
Yeah, exactly.
This is basically all about how it actually was brought about by like a particular series of like geopolitical decisions,
Exactly.
often led by Bill Casey.
Yes, yeah. and pretty much like all kinds of personalities in the Reagan cabinet and the National Security Council. And yeah, you're right. It does. This book interests me. One of the real, like the most interesting dynamics of it is kind of like navigating that contradiction, because Peter Schweizer, of how we look at the Soviet Union and like why it collapsed, because I think he spent some time in the early part of the book kind of breaking down, really taking a stand on the side of it was not inevitably doomed to collapse. However, he's also writing from a pretty anti-Soviet and anti-communist perspective, and a very kind of right-wing American perspective. So he has to take pot shots at the Soviet Union along the way and say, that their economy is not great, and that there's a lot of there's like internal dissension that has to be kind of managed, and there's vulnerabilities and choke points. But he kind of he really contrasts himself with a lot of the quotes from like very, very smart people at the time. He quotes in his introduction that and this is interesting as well, from like maybe people who weren't even like left wing, but they were establishment economists and political thinkers, academics, things like that. Like he writes that Arthur Schlesinger declared after a 1982 visit to Moscow, quote, "I found more goods in the shops, more food in the markets, more cars on the street, more of almost everything except, for some reason, caviar." With his literary guns directed at the Reagan administration, he summed up that those in the U.S. who think the Soviet Union is on the verge of economic and social collapse, ready with one small push to go over the brink, are only kidding themselves. Schlesinger compared these Americans with Soviet officials who saw capitalism in its final stages, noting that there were on both sides wishful thinkers who always see other societies as more fragile than they are. Each superpower has economic troubles. Neither is on the ropes. He says noted economist John Kenneth Galbraith made a similar assessment in 1984. Quote, "The Russian system succeeds because, in contrast to the Western industrial economies, it makes full use of its manpower. The Soviet economy has made great national progress in recent years." Distinguished Sovietologist Severin Bialer of Columbia University opined in Foreign Affairs in 1982, "The Soviet Union is not now, or will it be during the next decade, in the throes of a true systemic crisis, for it boasts enormous unused reserves of political and social stability that suffice to endure the deepest difficulties." Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson put it even more strongly in his textbook Economics in 1981. "It is a vulgar mistake to think that most people in Eastern Europe are miserable." And Professor Lester Thurow at MIT claimed as recently as the late 1980s in his textbook The Economic Problem, "Can economic command significantly compress and accelerate the growth process? The remarkable performance of the Soviet Union suggests that it can. In 1920, Russia was but a minor figure in the economic councils of the world. Today it is a country whose economic achievements bear comparison with those of the United States." And Strobe Talbot, who I feel like has gone on InfoWars before, in a highly charged article when Time magazine proclaimed Mikhail Gorbachev Man of the Decade, declared that the doves in the great debate of the past 40 years were right all along. He claimed that anti-communists like those in the Reagan administration based their views on, quote, "a grotesque exaggeration of what the Soviet Union could do. It was believed to be possessed of immense and malignant strength, including the self-confidence, prowess, and resources for the conduct of all-out war. The record, though, indicates that the opposite was largely true. It was the liberal and left that consistently overestimated the strength of the Soviet regime. As liberal left economist Robert Heilbronner admitted in Dissent, the farther to the right one looks, the more prescient has been historic foresight. The farther to the left, the less so." That lays out right there that the sort of like the lamestream experts in the early 1980s were absolutely not predicting the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. However, and I think this is from 1994, so he doesn't have a lot of time, but I think sitting in 2021, I think we can confidently say that the normative belief amongst so-called experts and historians and whatever nowadays is that the Soviet Union was destined to collapse. And Schweizer is pointing out that this understanding of it is kind of inverted, where it basically the sort of more liberal, detente kind of establishment, they thought that the Soviet Union would... it sounds like the way the real battle lines were drawn was like they didn't believe the Soviet Union was too stable to be toppled, and probably largely for that reason believed like one should not try to topple it because you're going to cause all kinds of problems. And it was Reagan who believed that it was vulnerable to collapse, but it needed a push, and we ought to give it that push, and he did, according to this book. But I think he's not. I think Schweizer does actually a pretty good job of at least outlining these different initiatives that were secretly, cooked up in the White House with a very small group of like senior level officials and advisors, and basically were rolled out to increasingly devastating effect throughout the 1980s, and then basically kind of laid the groundwork for the final coup de grace during the Bush era in, from 89 to 91.
Yeah.
Right.
It's an
but
interesting parallel to Iran. I mean, we were talking just before the show, like I was saying, like, I was talking about how everyone always, or, maybe less so in certain quarters, maybe among like academic historians, in the same way that Sovietologists didn't think the Soviet Union could ever collapse. Maybe they don't believe that the Iranian, regime, the mullahs, could collapse. Whereas, but I do feel that, even across the political spectrum, really, there's people always saying, like, it's about to collapse, it's about to collapse. But of course, like, it never does. It's almost like a QAnon level of sort of failed prophecy that's always happening. Like, every time there's some kind of protests, like the ones that seem an aeon ago now, that we witnessed relatively recently in Iran. That people were saying like, this is it. This is it's a bit like the mullahs are. It's gonna crumble.
It's happening.
But you did rightly point out, as I was saying that maybe there is parallel with the Soviet Union there, and if pressure were applied in the same way or like as effectively, like maybe very many countries could be brought down, but I don't know. I mean, of course, these parallels like are imperfect. I think that there's like obviously many different factors.
I think they're imperfect because, of course, the USSR and Iran were in kind of slightly different eras and like they're different countries. But I think the tactics that were employed by the U.S. government in the 1980s against the Eastern Bloc have basically just continued and expanded and become more sophisticated over the last 30 to 40 years. And which isn't to say that they're always 100% successful. I think they've had successes and they've had failures. But I think you see that, and of course, this goes all the way back to economic warfare tactics that Bill Casey sort of learned and developed going all the way back to World War II, where he was in the OSS and was put in charge of a kind of like economic sabotage operations using agents inside of Germany to attack the Nazis. Now, of course, he would become a very good friend to ultra right-wing anti-communist forces after that, but he very quickly and enthusiastically turned his attention on destroying communism, which, he kind of pursued throughout the rest of his professional life. And I think that there's even a connection with him with kind of like, we'll have to do a whole episode on this book one day, but Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. That's a book that Dave Emery references a lot, and I've only read through a little bit of it, but I know that Dave Emery has cited a lot of passages that talk about how Bill Casey was somebody who was kind of like, he was a young, up and coming banker, an OSS guy who was sort of given like stewardship of some of these Nazi money laundering accounts, like kind of underground Reich, like I think what maybe that book and Emery always calls like the Bormann Capital Flight Network. So like all of this wealth that basically was spirited out of the country to, whether it was to Switzerland or to South America or laundered through the Vatican Bank. Like Bill Casey was one of the guys who's kind of like put on that detail right at the end of World War II. So we're talking about a guy who goes back very deep in the game and with the kind of shadow economy world of like Mark Lombardi. And he had developed, but he never really got, I think, a chance to be like at the helm, like leading this kind of economic warfare campaign until he became CIA director in 1981. And then it seems like this was really the centerpiece of like his entire directorship and his vision for re-beefing up the CIA after it had taken some lumps in the 70s, and using it proactively to disrupt the Soviet Union's economy, their culture, their political movements, etc., on like almost every level, and wage an entire PSYOP campaign on them from like multiple different angles. Like basically throw everything on the board, like everything we can do to undermine, retard their economic development, like undermine deals that they're doing with European countries, escalate the covert war in Afghanistan, provide billions of dollars to Solidarity underground activists in Poland, and then later in the Czech Republic. This book, what I love about this book is that even though it doesn't have an index, or it seems like a table of contents or anything like that,
or
footnotes, not really
yeah.
footnotes. Like most of the sourcing,
no table of contents.
Yeah.
Oh, it does like, have endnotes. It does have endnotes. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, it's got some endnotes.
It has endnotes. Okay.
But what I really view this book as like an oral history from like people that were in the Reagan administration and were involved in these secret operations, like because most of the stuff is directly from interviews with like John Poindexter, Caspar Weinberger, Glenn Campbell, Richard Allen, Don Regan, William Clark, Robert McFarlane, Richard Pipes, all these people that had various roles within the Reagan administration, like the National Security Council, and some of them, I think some of those names popped up like in Contra 1 and like the October Surprise. That wasn't it? I think it might have been Richard Allen who was like, "You guys are just too stupid. Like, oh, like what are you from like a PBS network in Boston? Like, what KGB unit is paying you? You know, like that guy who was just like a total asshole to Robert Perry and
right.
And so you got him in the mix. And, a couple kind of Reagan loyal, like William Clark, his first, Reagan's first national security advisor, was like a longtime aide and friend to Reagan. So some of these people came from the very like reactionary, like California crowd, like going back to the 60s. Other people were, these like spooky, just sort of military intelligence world kind of hands. And of course you have, George H.W. Bush kind of putzing around in the margins, though he doesn't get, I'll say from the outset, like George H.W. Bush doesn't pop up so much in this story. He pops up less than you might imagine him to. And I almost found that a little bit suspicious. Almost like, not to say that Bill Casey wasn't like spearheading a lot of these things. I mean, this book does not really get into like Iran-Contra stuff. It mostly covers up to from like 81 to kind of 87, around the time that, Casey became ill and then, died of a brain tumor before he could testify, etc. But George H.W. Bush is kind of like around, but like it doesn't really. It seems like he was kind of read in on a lot of this stuff, but was not like part of the core group as perhaps like you might imagine him being. But I wonder if that's just like Schweizer being kind of smart and like not trying to wrap the Bushes too much. Because of course Bush was the president who like succeeded Reagan and then presided over the actual collapse of the communist bloc, the Soviet bloc, from 89 to 91. And the book doesn't really get into like, well, if they were doing all this subversion in the 80s, what were they doing from 89 to 91 to help, put the final nails in the coffin? Because they absolutely were doing something. The idea that George H.W. Bush just kind of sat on his hands and went to a few summits with Gorby and, promised him that NATO wouldn't encroach further east or whatever. And then just the internal contradictions just, did the rest of the work. I don't buy that at all. But, I think this is a valuable oral history of the guys who are essentially bragging about what they did. That's the other fun thing about this book. The interesting thing about it is that these guys are like boasting that they basically killed the evil empire, the evil communist empire. Like they did it. And they're like, if only we couldn't tell you at the time, but let me tell you how we totally fucked them over. And they're really like enthusiastic to like take responsibility for it. Not that they would they would get in trouble for it or anything today, but maybe just given the way the world has turned out, they would be a little bit like less ebullient than they were in 1993, for example. So you get these guys really kind of like telling on themselves in all kinds of interesting ways. And if you're reading this from any more of a kind of a anti-imperialist perspective, they really kind of incriminate themselves in a lot of ways, just like enthusiastically bragging. Right. It's very different vibe than like these guys sitting down with like Robert Perry, who they view as, like a fucking hippie, useful idiot, piece of shit liberal who's like trying to get them. They look at like this young buck, Peter Schweizer, this young nerd, who the dust jacket says lives in McLean, Virginia. So, he's definitely down with like the whole CIA crowd. They're speaking to a very sympathetic audience, and so they really kind of open up. I mean, Bill Casey is not interviewed because he's dead by the time he wrote this book, but a lot of these people kind of fill in anecdotally kind of what was Bill Casey up to and all these other things, and he was up to a lot. Pretty much, right?
Yeah. He definitely was up to a lot. He's like constantly jet setting all around the world, it's crazy. Like through his diplomacy, you really get a picture of, he's a good focus because you really get a picture of the global scope of all this intrigue. And it definitely is. Yeah, it's very interesting to see this kind of like alternate stance than what you often hear about the kind of ideological victory of in the Cold War. That it was like a fair fight or whatever, whereas this is more bragging about causing the collapse, which is unique and definitely interesting. It would be, it's more interesting perhaps than a non-sympathetic analysis of how like this collapse was caused, because it's like an inside perspective that it is really, I think bragging is an apt description, or at least like valorizing what was done and applauding. It makes sense that this would be something that would be consulted as like a manual by people who are looking to apply the same ideas to other contexts.
For sure. And even I think it has a lot of relevance to even like the geopolitical tensions that exist between Russia and the U.S. today. Like like the like China and the relationship between China and the United States is a really interesting part of this book to me, especially because for sure.
A lot of it really pivots on or has to do with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the sort of like. The Saudis play like a huge role in this, and like a lot of what motivates them is their concern over the possibility of like an Iran-style uprising in Saudi Arabia. And of course, there's like lots of diplomacy going on between the Zia government in Pakistan and Bill Casey. Especially like vis-a-vis the whole Chinese situation, where it's really like something that's very interesting that I think we definitely should go into is the way that China kind of tried to make strategic concessions to like actually the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province, quote unquote new territory, to try to sort of play that against Russia. And they were seen as, by Bill Casey and by the United States in general as like a potential ally against the Soviets, and despite the fact that they were communist and all of that.
that is something that I kind of didn't expect jumping out when I started this book, was like the very cozy relationship in some respects between like the intelligence apparatuses of China and Bill Casey.
Yeah, they took a lot of ideas from him. And it's crazy because they really had like their own sort of like radio free Asia, it's interesting to see like the kind of same ideas be sort of reversed and instrumentalized like in a different direction. They would and they sort of they were, of course. The friction between like the CCP and the Uyghurs goes back like a long way, but they kind of strategically like modulated their position in that struggle, like in order to make Russia seem less appealing, and like conducted a massive propaganda campaign, like partially at the behest of Bill Casey, to try to manipulate these
and it's fascinating because it is like a literal kind of mirror. It's like an inversion of what China claims is being done to them in Xinjiang nowadays, that like Western or Turkish kind of influences or Saudi influences are trying to stir up the Muslims in that region, when in the 80s, as you said, they basically were trying to stir up the ethnic Kyrgyz population and like the ethnic Muslim groups that were in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and stuff, and trying to stir up shit inside of the Soviet border, and doing it kind of like in collaboration with a very right-wing U.S. administration, and of course also providing arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. That was another thing they were doing, and were even entertaining the idea of like if there could be some kind of like Islamic separatist violence that happened in the border regions in Soviet Central Asia that would become like attacking that soft underbelly of the USSR. Like they were totally here for it. And I mean, you just hate to see two communist superpowers like fighting like this, like what, and like one of them collaborating with like Bill Casey, like what the Sino-Soviet split. Really, you're feeling the fucking reverberations of it all throughout this book. Just like how it was like so easy for America to slip in there and play them against each other.
It definitely goes to show as well that like some of the put on obliviousness to like the concerns about like religious freedom that they show now, like in the current sort of situation in Xinjiang, they like it kind of shows how that is a little bit put on, where like they definitely knew enough to like try to like scale it back when it came down to trying to like position themselves as more friendly to Islam than the Soviets. They were able to understand that this is like hostile to like people's practice of their religion. But like now they're like, what are you talking about? It's just
Well, and I wonder to what extent like their the feeling of like the security apparatus in China is like it remembers these 1980s eras and like are afraid of this thing being weaponized back towards them the way they once weaponized it to get at the Soviets. Like they inherently see like trends of religiosity or whatever as kind of like something that was weaponized by a hostile actor that's like coming to get them or something like that. Like they've already kind of put this into like the box of like a kind of national security paradigm back in the 80s. And so perhaps that has seeped into the thinking like even today. And
there definitely is like a sense of like the instrumentality of it, where they definitely saw this as something that could be used as a tool. But I think that definitely there is like on some I'm sure like maybe there are some who kind of have forgotten, but I think that there definitely is like a memory that exists, which I think definitely indicts their policy as well as like serves to explain it in some ways. where it's something that it's a case of projection that we often encounter in talking about these geopolitical things, where
Вчера слишком поздно лег, сегодня рано встал. Я вчера слишком поздно лег, я почти не спал. Мне, наверное, с утра нужно было пойти к врачу. А теперь электричка везет меня туда, куда я не хочу. Электричка везет меня туда, куда я не хочу. Электричка везет меня туда, куда я не хочу.
Just to dive a little more into China for a moment, I just want to read something from, I guess it's like page 64, about when Bill Casey flew to have a secret meeting with China. I believe that this would have been in either 1981 or 82. He visited President Zia in Pakistan. We'll get to him shortly, but then went over to China, and Schweizer wrote that the Chinese, with their long common border with the Soviet Union, were tying down almost 500,000 Soviet troops. By virtue of geography, China was also proving increasingly important as an American intelligence partner. When the Shah fell in 1979, the U.S. lost access to some of its most important and secret eavesdropping facilities. Located along Iran's northern frontier, they were a perfect window onto ballistic missile testing being done in the desolate plains of Soviet Central Asia. Months after the Shah's fall, Stansfield Turner, Carter's CIA director, had begun negotiations with Chinese officials about establishing joint facilities in western China. It was more or less a done deal. There were only a few hang-ups and technical issues. Who would man the facilities? Would China be given access to the technologies at the facilities? The issues were quickly settled. The next order of business was the Afghan project. China had been selling Soviet equipment to the Mujahideen. Casey told his hosts about the problems with the Egyptian equipment. He wanted to purchase more from Beijing. Would they agree? Yes, they said, again, with few questions asked. The director then turned to a more sensitive subject related to the Afghan war, Soviet Central Asia. For years, Moscow and Beijing had been bantering back and forth, trying to exploit ethnic tensions on each other's side of the border. On December 4th, 1980, the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzia, Sultan Ibrahimov, had been murdered in his sleep in a resort town east of Frunze, only 100 miles from the Afghan border. Officials of the KGB believed that he was assassinated by Muslim extremists and had implied Chinese participation. Beijing had denied any involvement, but the problems were not only on the Soviet side. On the Chinese side of the Kyrgyz border, in the province of Xinjiang, there was also tension. In October 1980, after reports of discord and unrest, a member of China's Politburo was sent on a 2-week tour of the remote province. On October 16th, Wang Zhen called for increased security because of the, quote, new czars across the border, who were, quote, stretching their tentacles into China. Zhen had been able, while in Xinjiang, to listen to propaganda radio broadcasts from Frunze criticizing Beijing and encouraging resistance to Chinese rule. No doubt the Chinese were doing the same thing. In fact, they had only recently dramatically expanded the reach of Radio Urumqi, which was being beamed into Soviet Central Asia. So Casey shared with his hosts leaflets that the Afghan Mujahideen were smuggling into Soviet Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. It was an Afghan project at this point, but Casey was thinking about backing it and turning up the propaganda a notch or two. It was sensitive because the Chinese might not like the thought of stirring the ethnic pot. After all, they might get involved in the imbroglio. Islam, like communism, had no borders. There was no guarantee that the message would not boomerang and cause problems in China. To Casey's delight, Chinese intelligence liked the idea and offered to contribute to the cause. They are soft in the South, said the director of Chinese intelligence. Casey himself couldn't have said it better. The New York Catholic Irishman and the peasant communist from Hunan province were reading from the same script. Okay, so reading from the same script,
because that's one of the parts that I find that I picked out as well as being very interesting.
Dangists, I don't know what's going on there, but and it is interesting how this, it makes a note, I think it is in this part, right, that the, I guess it's in a different part. It talks about how, in general, like, the, sort of, sympathy of the Muslim world had actually been with the Soviet Union, relative to China, because they had been, they had similar, oppressive policies to the ones that they have now. But this, was an effort to kind of shift that. I'll see if I can find that part. But it's a very interesting thing, and I think that it definitely has resonances with the politics in the Muslim world right now. There's many interesting components to it in terms of like how the leadership in the Muslim world is positioned vis-a-vis China and Xinjiang. Mm-hmm. And of course, like Afghanistan was, I think,
although everyone knows,
so I guess do we want to talk? Do we want to break down like the main planks of like this strategy and like what were Bill Casey's like biggest the choke points that he identified to take down the Soviet Union in 1981? So obviously one of those was he wanted to escalate the U.S. covert involvement in the Afghan war, against the Soviet army there. And that had actually been approved under Carter and Brzezinski and Stanfield Turner, I think right after the Soviets intervened, probably in the last, 1980. But basically, Schweizer points this out a number of times, that the original, executive order or national security directive from the Carter administration gave a mandate to basically support the Mujahideen to harass Soviet forces. That was the language of the order. So, Schweizer makes a big deal about how, the U.S. involvement from the beginning was not to, like, beat the Soviets or, like, lead the Mujahideen to victory, because that was, frankly, a laughable concept in 1980. Like, there was resistance to the Soviet intervention and everything, but it was mostly like rural, peasants and things like that who had very old weaponry. You mentioned earlier, like the Egypt problem. They were getting some guns from Egypt, but a lot of them were like bolt action rifles and just like crappy equipment. So that's when they hooked up with China to basically get China to bring in like Soviet weapons that they had, and then there would be plausible deniability if rebels were killed. They wouldn't have like a fucking M16 with them, So the CIA, wouldn't have its fingerprints on it. But Casey really wanted to like intensify that, and that took a few years. But then once they intensified it, it got very intense. That was one plank. The second big plank was Poland. I think it's safe to say Bill Casey did not forget about Poland. He did not forget about it, and he was convinced. And Bill Casey was like it said, an devout Irish Catholic, and also a Knight of Malta, I believe. Right. Yes. Very
Catholic
plugged in.
Is a very interesting part of all of this, for sure.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so he identified that there was a potentiality, especially with the new Pope who came in, John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, who was Polish and was pretty anti-communist to begin with, that, Casey immediately identified that he wanted to go to the Vatican and enlist their support to help use basically like Catholic rat lines to funnel support to the Solidarność, the Solidarity underground revisionist puppets of imperialism democracy movement that was happening, that came out of Gdansk in 1980. Sorry, showing my but anyways, so basically, yeah, like that was another thing of like basically turning up the heat on the Polish government, both in how it dealt with like this solidarity movement and then also its financial troubles, because Poland got into something that a lot of Warsaw Pact countries and Yugoslavia got into in the 1970s, which I have to research more, but I'm inclined to say was not a very good idea, which was to take tons of loans from the IMF to basically kind of paper over whatever. And actually, in the 70s, I mean, if you ever do talk to post-communist people who lived in some of those countries, the 70s are like universally usually regarded as kind of like the good times. Like they were a pretty good era. Like things were, there was like a kind of cultural thaw in the kind of post-Khrushchev era, but the economy was like stable, and they had this kind of foreign capital that was borrowed to kind of boost like consumer goods and luxury goods and cars and things like that. And I mean, like it was humming along, and the U.S. was like tripping over its dick in Vietnam, and things seemed like maybe, so it wasn't wild to think like going into like 1980 that the Soviets are just like they're teetering, they're ready to fall. But there were some hard times coming with paying back some of this debt, and basically I guess the orientation of a lot of the Western European countries starting out in like 1981 was kind of more conciliatory, and they actually were kind of on this cautious path of more economic involvement with the Warsaw Pact countries, places like West Germany, France, the UK, Italy, etc. And, I mean, given that it was still kind of we're in the tail end of like this détente era, they were, basically Eastern Bloc countries had certain kinds of access to like the Western financial system, and Western governments could like give them loans and things like that. And so Casey like looks at this and says, oh, well, here you go right here. We can fuck them on the debt that they owe, more or less, and then use that to like exacerbate the social and political problems that are going on in the country, and then basically kind of dare the Soviets to first, I mean, the result that he did achieve from it is he got the Soviets for a while to expend a lot of money bailing out some of these socialist countries in lieu of like sending in the tanks and occupying them. Poland went into martial law in 1981, and there was fear for a while that there would be a kind of like a Hungary 56 or Prague 68. Like basically if General Jaruzelski, the Polish leader, like couldn't get things under control, the Red Army would come in to establish control. And I guess ultimately they decided against doing that and ended up kind of bailing out some of these countries. But there was some cracks in the foundation, and Casey was like determined to basically exploit them to the max. And to do that, he had to get the Vatican on his side. So I think, there was a really interesting passage in the book where he goes to the Vatican for the first time in let's see, I think right after he kind of got elected. Let's see. Well, I'll find it in a second, but I'll just say really quickly the third thing. Obviously, the Contra War in Nicaragua was a whole nother plank in this, but the book Victory doesn't really get into it. But the other big plank, which we just recently talked about, was SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So actually, I mean, even though LaRouche's name is not mentioned in this book once, the great LaRouchian idea looms very large and is given quite a bit of credit in this book as being something that really pushed the Soviets' backs against the wall and also functioned as like a very effective psyop against them. Because they weren't sure how feasible it was, or if, and Gorbachev is quoted openly as saying that the purpose of the SDI is basically to like intimidate us into spending tons more money on defense than we already are, and basically draining resources from every other area of the economy in this like crazy madcap race to like catch up with the spooky laser weapons, and then it's going to bankrupt us. Which I wouldn't say that's what did it on its own, but it's certainly buying into like the hype of SDI. I think did not help. Because they did spend they had a really tremendous military buildup between like 1985 and 1990. At the same time, Gorbachev was trying to do glasnost and perestroika, which just ended up ultimately being kind of a huge clusterfuck for a lot of reasons. But it didn't help that they had to like throw all of this money and resources into like this laser beam project to like not be outfoxed by America. So Schweizer gives a lot of credit as basically hastening this whole process, and Reagan was, I guess, like genuinely like really down with Star Wars. He loved it, and he wouldn't back down. Gorbachev would like demand, that was like his first demand. It's like, you have to stop this SDI bullshit, and Reagan absolutely wouldn't. But
Reagan's remark about Gorbachev was really a standout in this book. That he said he's a different type of Soviet leader. He is the first one who weighs more than his wife.
Fat shaming Reagan.
He was fat shaming. He was being fat phobic, and a whole host of other things. But most of all, he was fat phobic. Very, very bizarre comment. Yeah, shows that not much has changed in this era of faux 45. You still have those very unacceptable statements flying around.
Yes, he said a lot of it does reveal his kind of casual malice that he has for the Soviet people. I think he wrote in his diary very early on when Bill Casey dumped one of his big rambling mumbling lectures about the Soviet menace, that he said I think I think Bill is right, and I think we should do all these things so that they either have to say uncle or starve. And it's just kind of oh, cool.
No, for sure. He comes off as kind of a sociopath in this book. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, maybe not kind of, maybe just a sociopath, but, he just really wants to destroy the Soviet Union. Determined to do so.
Now, going back to the Vatican for a second, it was one of the kind of earliest trips in I think 1981 where he went there, and Pope John Paul II was very anti-Marxist and anti-communist, and Reagan believed apparently that the Pope was the key figure in determining the fate of Poland. Reagan was overcome by the outpouring of emotion that emanated from the millions who came to see him when he visited Krakow in 1979. There were tears in Reagan's eyes. Cool, whatever. So basically, Bill Casey goes, it also notes that the pontiff was a strong and vocal critic of Marxism everywhere. In March 1980, he gave a strangely worded speech in Mexico warning against the dangers of liberation theology, a branch of radical Catholic thinking that tied Christianity with Marxism-Leninism. Sounds kind of cool. The Pope's speech positioned the Vatican firmly against pro-communist priests in places such as Nicaragua and El Salvador, all of Latin America for that matter. His views made him unpopular in that church of communism, the Kremlin. Not only was he now the one individual at the highest moral authority in Poland, but he was also popular among Lithuanians, in whose tongue he was fluent. Seemingly mindful of their plight, the Pope had appointed the imprisoned Lithuanian Archbishop Cardinal Impectore in 1979, and the press wrote about the Pope as a threat to be managed or contained. His views and faith were, quote, infection. For the present leadership in the Vatican, the Ukraine is an object of particular solicitude. It is trying to use the still considerable active nucleus of the Catholic Church as a basis for extending religious influence over the population of the Republic. A Soviet Ukrainian pamphlet titled In the Service of the Neo-Fascists used these vehement words: "Revanchists and enemies of democracy and socialism look with hope upon the new Pope, for he has made it his goal to unite Catholics all over the planet into a single anti-communist force. It is dictated not by anxiety for mankind and its future, but by the desire for religious authority over the planet." So they were not, there was some beef going on. They didn't like it. But when Casey went there, he requested that the Rome station set up a private meeting with Agostino Cardinal Casaroli, the Secretary of State at the Vatican. And he was a dedicated church leader who had been a close advisor to 4 popes. He had served with great distinction and favored closer normalized relations with the communist governments of Eastern Europe. It was Ostpolitik, forging in a slow but deliberate manner state-to-state relations between the Vatican and the communist bloc. Casaroli claimed he had a conflict in his schedule and could not meet the director. Casey figured the refusal was a reflection of the secretary's foreign policy. Casaroli had met recently with leftist rebel leaders from El Salvador and Marxist Palestinian leaders. There had been no direct request from the president for a meeting, so Casaroli could gracefully decline. He did offer to dispatch an aide to meet the DCI, but complete discretion would be required. Public disclosure of the meeting would play into Soviet hands by fueling speculation that the Church and the CIA were plotting to overthrow Poland. Casey, never too concerned about protocol, agreed. They set up like a secret little, sneaky little meeting that nobody would notice, and he sent, Casaroli's aide came, dressed in his church garb, with a cherub-like face and active eyes. He greeted Casey warmly and apologized for Casaroli's inability to meet with Casey. He appeared uneasy himself. After all, Vatican officials were not often seen in the company of the director of the CIA. Casey tried to ease his anxiety by making it clear early on he just wanted insights into the situation in Poland. And so he gave him his, basically a rundown of kind of what was happening. The Pope was convinced that repression would come sooner or later. What mattered was the form it would take and how prepared the church and opposition would be. The food crisis was spreading, and the strikes would continue to grow. The church hoped to facilitate the process of reform without inviting a clampdown, but minus Cardinal Wyszynski, who had just died, it would not be as easy. After nearly 2 hours, Casey thanked the aide and asked him if Casaroli might be available the next time the director came to Rome. "No," said the aide flatly. "The cardinal thinks it best not to cooperate on these matters, or we might inflame the situation." It was an abrupt turn down, but it would not matter. The fact was, they were already helping with important intelligence. Casey had learned more about the internal situation in Poland in this one meeting than he had from all the briefers at Langley. And what he heard confirmed what his instincts were telling him and what President Reagan was willing to commit to. Although there weren't any hard-signed agreements, clearly in terms of gathering intelligence and sharing it, the Vatican was very helpful, recalls Admiral John Poindexter, and events would soon unfold, bringing the Vatican into an even closer relationship with the United States, particularly where their interests coincided in Poland. Within a few weeks of Casey's departure from Rome, there would be an assassination attempt on the Pope. The President, Caspar Weinberger, and Bill Casey would see a veiled Soviet hand behind the whole thing. So would the Pontiff. Basically the Pope kind of turns a cold shoulder to Bill Casey, and the Secretary of State doesn't really want to fuck with him because he prefers Ostpolitik. And then just a few weeks later, a very sus gray wolf Turkish neo-Nazi takes a shot at the Pope, and then that is blamed on basically the Bulgarian KGB, which actually, I guess, the Pope believes. And thus, once, he believes that they had, made an attempt on his life, then he was more open to committing the resources of the Catholic Church to the basically underground CIA operations to support solidarity and to undermine the government of Poland. So, I don't know. It just seems a little interesting, the timing of all that.
Yes. I think we might have talked about this a little bit before on our the suspiciousness of the timing on the first on the October surprise episode. If I'm not mistaken, we talked about some of this entry. Definitely something interesting.
They sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. I'm coming now, I'm coming to reward them. First, we take Manhattan. Then we take Berlin. I'm guided by a signal in the heavens. I'm guided by this birthmark on my skin. I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. First, we take Manhattan. Then we take Berlin.
I really like to live inside you, baby. I love your body and your spirit and your blood. But you see that night there moving through the station. I told you I was one of love.
Now you love me as a loser, but now you're worried that I just might win. You know the way to stop me, but you don't have the discipline. How many nights I prayed for this to let my work begin. First, we take Manhattan. Then we take Berlin. I don't like your fashion business, mister. And I don't like these drugs that keep you thin.
One part that I think is kind of goes into it shows really you can see kind of in Casey's travel the way that this is all it stretches across so many different domains and interconnects all these different areas. There's a part that I like that kind of deals with a lot of what we've talked about both in Poland and in Central Asia on 176. Where it starts off with him meeting with Zia he meets with Zia in his presidential office, then he goes to meet with the ISI in their command office. So he met with Brigadier General Mohammed Yousaf, director of the ISI's Afghan Bureau, and General Akhtar. The three sat down informally over some Afghan tea and light delicacies. At a simple work table, they started out discussing the conduct of the war in Afghanistan. The arms pipeline was now working with only a few glitches, and the quality of arms arriving had improved. The Mujahideen leaders had finally agreed to some sort of unified political structure thanks to the hard work of General Akhtar. Now it was only a question of getting greater cooperation on the battlefield. When discussions turned to the Soviet side of the war, there was an air of concern. Intelligence sources in Kabul were telling the Pakistani ISI that Moscow was considering the division of Afghanistan, with the north becoming part of Soviet territory. The Soviets could not control Afghanistan, so they made a plan to divide Afghanistan into two halves, recalls Yousaf. They planned on exploiting the north-south rivalry within Afghanistan and claiming the north as their own. To counter the move, the ISI was planning to further enlarge operations in the northern provinces. Akhtar wanted to train thousands of additional Mujahideen on an emergency basis and send them to the northern reaches of Afghanistan, but he needed extra funds. Could the CIA help? As he always did, Casey agreed to come up with the money to attain an additional 6,000 Mujahideen for the north. But then the DCI raised the notion of pushing even farther north into the Soviet Union itself. Casey went toward the wall map in the office. In rolled-up shirt sleeves and loosened tie, he began. The Soviet Union is vulnerable to ethnic tensions. It is the last multi-ethnic empire and eventually will face national challenges. Northern Afghanistan, as I'm sure he said, is a springboard to Soviet Central Asia. Pointing to the map and then looking at its hosts, he said, "This is the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. We should smuggle literature to stir dissent. Then we should ship arms to encourage local uprisings." The room was completely silent. It was a shocking suggestion. Yusuf recalls being a little surprised at the bluntness of Casey's tone and suggestion. Mr. Casey was conscious of the Soviet weakness and grave vulnerability, and Mr. Casey was the first one to have openly pointed out this vulnerability. I can vividly remember that he used this phrase, soft underbelly. As you know, Mr. Casey was a highly diplomatic, secretive, and intelligent man who would never easily give away his true feelings. But surprisingly, he never tried to hide his built-in hatred for communism and in particular the USSR. Putting together a military operation and carrying it into the Soviet Union had never been done. There had been no combat on Soviet territory since the Second World War. The diplomatic and military repercussions could be colossal. Pakistan as a sponsor of the Mujahideen could be target for military retaliation, but so could its sponsor, particularly if it became known in the Kremlin that this was a Reagan initiative. Yet the strategic opportunity was hard to pass up. How better to punish Moscow for its aggressive actions in Afghanistan than to bring the war to its soil? People living in northern Afghanistan and Soviet Central Asia had much in common ethnically. They had more common blood than the people of northern and southern Afghanistan. They shared religion, culture, and history. Since the late 1970s, Moscow had become particularly concerned about the spread of Islam in the Soviet Central Asia. Units of the KGB and the Asian republics were tasked with aggressively clamping down on the flourishing underground Islamic revival. The Iranian Revolution and the Jihad in Afghanistan were encouraging acts of defiance throughout the republics. The next morning, having discussed several ventures in details, Bill Casey boarded his plane. He left behind the embryo of perhaps the most bold covert operation of the Cold War era. Pakistan had consented to plans to attack targets inside the Soviet Union. The Pakistani ISI began almost immediately exploring how the secret war inside the communist superpower should be launched. Several possibilities were being considered. Casey had suggested sending books and literature in first, along with exploratory teams to get a feel for the local situation. Muhammad Yusuf began discussions with the CIA psychological warfare expert about what sort of literature might be distributed. An Uzbek, who had been working for the CIA since the late 1940s, he suggested the Quran and several obscure books describing Soviet atrocities against Uzbeks. The CIA paid to have tens of thousands printed and brought to Peshawar. Weeks later, Yusuf summoned a number of Mujahideen commanders from the northern provinces to his office. A comprehensive screening process soon began. Candidates for the super-secret probes into the Soviet Union would have to be completely trustworthy in both temperament and politics. The operations would require dexterity and courage, subtlety and discretion. After completing the screening, Yusuf asked several commanders to make contact with Soviet citizens across the Amu River and do some investigating. Would the Quran be welcomed? Would any locals be willing to participate in future operations or share intelligence on Soviet troop movements or industrial installations? Could some locals act as guides? He wanted more information before any operations were started. At the same time, Yusuf summoned an outsider to his office. Wali Beg, a pseudonym, was 53 but looked much older. He had an ivory white beard and worn, tired skin. He was a farmer and an Uzbek who had lived much of his life in Afghanistan on the southern banks of the Amu. His house was near the northern tip of Kunduz province, near the ancient Afghan port of Sherkhan. As a boy, Beg regularly crossed the Amu with his father to meet relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents living on the other side. He used a traditional ferry, a flat-bottomed boat pulled by two swimming horses. He was familiar with the area. The Soviets had driven Beg from his home, killing 2 sons and a daughter. He was now living in Pakistan as a carpet maker. Beg had great knowledge of the area and would provide an independent analysis of the situation. For our purpose, Wali's knowledge of the border region, coupled with his oath of vengeance against the Soviets, made him an ideal mujahideen to carry the war over the Amu, recalls Yusuf. From Pakistan, Casey ventured to Saudi Arabia for secret meetings with King Fahd and Prince Turki. Despite having circumnavigated half the globe, Casey was bubbling with enthusiasm as he landed in Riyadh. After a morning mass, arranged in secret by his Saudi hosts, he prepared for his meetings, right? The Afghan program was running smoothly, which would please Fahd. The king enjoyed getting updates on the war and hearing news of great victories, and the Saudi security program was progressing nicely. The agency had been able to tip the Saudis off about several potential threats. Casey entered the royal palace and was greeted warmly by the king. It had been a hard few months since their last meeting, and at that time, Fahd had been somber, even slightly depressed. The Saudi economy was in a tailspin, with oil revenues down sharply. Production had been cut back to stabilize the world price. Natural gas was an inviting alternative, replacing oil in a growing number of industries around the world. The Saudi role as a swing producer had worked well when the market was solid, but with rampant overproduction by a number of countries, that role was becoming very costly. Along with these economic woes, the tempo of Iranian intrusions into Saudi airspace was rising, and the visit paid by President Hassani of South Yemen to Moscow in November reignited lingering paranoia about Soviet designs in the region. Members of the Reagan administration, particularly the Kaspar Weinberger and Bill Casey, were quick to allay such fears as they assured the Saudis of U.S. commitment. The most immediate security concern was Iran. At the suggestion of the NSC, President Reagan had requested the CIA launch a covert operation to overthrow Ayatollah Khomeini. The program was just beginning and was pretty mild. The CIA was establishing a chain of covert sanctuaries in Turkey for anti-Khomeini exiles. Distributing leaflets and making propaganda broadcasts was the extent of the activity. It was not expected to do much to the mullah's hold on power, and would do little to offer comfort to King Fahd. At the same time, Operation Staunch, a worldwide campaign to persuade countries not to sell arms to Iran, was in full swing. Pushed by the Secretary of State George Shultz, Staunch could be devastating to Iran if the pieces were brought into place. The diplomatic side was being handled by the state, but the CIA was taking care of the more delicate covert aspects of the operation. He goes on with his meeting with Fahd, which involves Prince Bandar.
Bandar makes many appearances in this as the U.S. ambassador, the Saudi ambassador to the U.S.
Yeah, and the Stinger missiles come up. But from there, this is maybe an interesting part to read. Fahd suggested the United States consider an approach to the Iranians. The Saudis had historically tried to maintain relations even with their enemies. Fahd thought there might be benefits in dialogue, particularly with Iranian moderates. Casey gave a muted response to the suggestion. He then pulled out some folio folders and placed them before the king. They were intelligence updates on the Afghan project and on the decision reached with Zia to take the war into Soviet Central Asia. This was about throwing off the Russian yoke and freeing the passions of millions of devout Muslims, Casey told Fahd. It would also convince Moscow to reconsider its commitment to Afghanistan by substantially raising the stakes. Casey wanted to bring the Saudis in on the deal and perhaps convince Turkey to commit his resources in the region to a joint operation. It wouldn't be too blatant or large, just something to stir the pot. Fahd agreed in principle to cooperate, but wanted more specifics. Casey agreed to relay the plans through Turkey as soon as they were developed. The two discussed several joint operations, including destabilization operations against two Saudi foes, Libya and South Yemen. The CIA had excellent
nothing new under the sun, right? Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun. Yeah, the CIA had excellent intelligence on the leadership in South Yemen, and if there was any more plotting against Riyadh, it was hoped the Americans would know about it. So from Saudi Arabia, he flew to Israel and Turkey, and then on to Western Europe to review the Poland operation. So, all back-to-back, chaining all these flights, he went there. He met in secret with Archbishop Luigi Poggi, a Vatican diplomat who handled contacts with the Polish government. Casey had hoped to meet the pontiff again, but the archbishop sat across the table instead. Poggi had just returned from meetings in Warsaw with the Polish foreign minister Stefan Olszewski, with whom he had discussed the possibility of... Olszewski? Oh, sorry.
Olszewski.
Poggi, a whiz at Latin and church history, looked like a simple parish priest. But he was a sharp political thinker and had a solid grasp of the nuances of diplomacy, as well as a tough streak that could reveal itself all too quickly. Poland was not far off in the discussion. The administration was concerned because U.S. intelligence sources in the Polish Ministry of Defense had reported that a renewed silent offensive against the underground was being organized by the Interior Ministry. It was going to take several forms, the most sinister to include the killing of certain activists to sow fear in the hearts of anyone considering anti-state activities. A wave of mysterious murders was already passing through Poland.
I'm really this the Grzegorz Brzemiek.
Yes. Okay. So he was the 19-year-old son of a dissident. Yeah, maybe you want to take over.
I'll just take over. I'll flex my Slavic muscles here. Grzegorz Brzemiek, the 19-year-old son of the dissident poet Barbara Sadowska, was beaten to death by police. Andrzej Grzegorz Gaszewski, a solidarity activist, was seized by the police and several days later turned up dead on a railroad embankment. Jan Samsonovich, another activist, was found hanging from a wall in the Gdansk shipyards. The Reagan administration was worried about the survival of the underground leadership, Bujak, Kuran, and also Lech Wałęsa. Church leaders were also probably targets, Casey told Poggi. or Poggi, he asked the Archbishop to relay a warning to his contacts in Poland and have them spread the word. Unable to restrain or contain the underground, the martial law government would no doubt try to decapitate it. Yeah, and, at the same time, so the church, Poggi said, the church was divided between radicals who wanted to back the opposition fully and those who favored a more accommodating approach to the government. It was an extraordinary admission about internal church matters from an archbishop, but perhaps he was returning what he saw as Casey's honesty about American limitations and weaknesses. The division between the church was exposed in the small industrial suburb of Ursus when more than 2,000 Poles packed into a Roman Catholic church to challenge the Polish primate, Józef Cardinal Glemp. The primate had reassigned Reverend Mieczysław Nowak of Ursus, an outspoken supporter of Solidarity, to another parish. It was a squabble that was being replicated throughout Poland. The Jaruzelski government and its masters in Moscow no doubt enjoyed the spectacle. At the same time the church was experiencing division, the Polish economy was in bad straits. Poggi wanted the Reagan administration to know that sanctions were costly, $12 billion by one Polish government estimate, and Jaruzelski was of the clear opinion that the economic deterioration was to the advantage of his opponents on both sides, Solidarity and hardliners who believed he had not been brutal enough against domestic enemies. Poggi advised Casey that the administration should keep the sanctions in place because Jaruzelski would eventually seek some sort of compromise. The health of the underground was mixed. The government was holding about 1,000 activists in all, the most important group of leaders at Mokotów prison on Warsaw's Rakowiecka Street. The group included Jacek Kuron, Adam Michnik, Zbigniew Romaszewski, who had set up Solidarity's clandestine radio network with CIA backing, and Henryk Wujec, a Catholic intellectual. But they were writing letters, and so, that was a thing that sanctions were slapped on Poland, which, you see a lot of parallels to, what the U.S. government does today, to, whether it's Iran or Cuba or Venezuela or Russia. We are, extremely trigger-happy now with our sanctions. We almost don't even try to, the U.S. government doesn't even really try to hide the sort of the weaponization of it, but yet they're not seen as something that is actual violence or even bad in some circles. It's very, I'm sure with President Joe we're going to see a lot of sanctions, but they did this, and they did this in the full awareness that it was going to tighten the screws on them at a very vulnerable time. So I guess let's see. It was in reaction to the martial law declaration in Poland in 1981, and I guess that was a turning point for the administration. I'm reading page 68. It solidified support behind an offensive strategy to roll back Soviet power. Within months, secret directives would be signed, making explicit U.S. policy to undermine Soviet power and calling for a comprehensive economic war to be launched, and opportunities would be sought for sowing dissent in Eastern Europe. So shortly after the declaration of martial law, the president spoke with his advisors about Poland. Much of the NSC was not included because NSC meetings were not considered leak-proof, so they didn't want to risk anything. But at the meeting were Vice President Bush, William Clark, Secretaries Haig and Weinberger, Ed Meese, Richard Pipes, and William Casey. And there's a general consensus the United States had to send a strong message to Warsaw and Moscow. Economic sanctions were universally supported as a way of demonstrating American anger. But then Pipes raised the stakes. What about doing something proactive? What about covertly funding Solidarity to ensure that the first anti-communist organization above ground in the Soviet bloc survived this harsh political winter? The specter of such a risky operation haunted the room. After a few minutes, Al Haig cut through the silence with his explosive voice. "That's crazy. It just won't work," he said. "The Soviets would never tolerate it. Solidarity is lost." Bush agreed, expressed concerns about inflaming Moscow, and counseled against any operation. Interesting, Bush. What are you up to here? Pipes, the only NSC staffer at the meeting and a Pole himself, explains a lot, tried to contain his anger. "What worries the Soviets is the survival of Solidarity," he retorted. "They are afraid of an infection, that it will spread to the rest of the Soviet bloc, even Lithuania and Russia itself. You don't know the Poles, Mr. Secretary. Solidarity will survive." Weinberger, Casey, and Bill Clark voiced enthusiastic support for the operation, but the president, quote, didn't need any encouragement, according to Pipes. He immediately asked Casey to draw up a covert operation plan. He not only wanted to free Poland, but shatter the myth of Soviet invincibility, recalls Clark. So that's what they, in 81, they decided, like, we're going all out on Poland, and they set up, and actually what's interesting about this, so he first went to the Vatican to basically try to get rat lines set up via the church, but of course for kind of like geopolitical reasons they were a little bit hesitant first. So he actually, the way he set up the solidarity rat lines was through Israel. So another player in the whole Iran-Contra galaxy comes in there.
Yeah, to go back like a little bit to like the sort of later portion, like on like 176, like where he has this long sort of plane trip like from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia, and then to the Vatican to talk to the Archbishop, like, and the whole secret mass that he's like permitted by King
Yes,
Fahd,
the Saudis built. The Saudis
like
had a secret church for him. I don't know if they built it for him, but they like offered to like secretly whisk him into like this Catholic church so he could pray.
Yeah,
which is
that's
funny.
like where I feel like you see like the whole like subliminal jihad like components of this, and you see like the whole like the way that this is like really like an eschatological sort of struggle, and like the destinies of these like great religions are being kind of like shaped. You can really see like the way that these formations, it wasn't necessarily set in stone the way that things would shake out. Like they were being actively shaped through like the decisions that Casey and like the Saudis and like Zia were all making at the time. Like how, where they thought the future of Islam, for instance, like, and the Catholics are doing the same on their end. And I think that you can see the way that's borne itself out as well. But, they
look at Poland today.
Like,
look at Poland and, like, Afghanistan today, and you can see kind of how it worked out, like, in terms of igniting the flame of a certain kind of religiosity.
They were making a judgment about, like, what they thought was, like, and definitely they had reason. I don't think that, like, the stuff they were concerned about, like, the reason why King Fahd, like, really hated the Soviets, like, because of like his strong like religious sentiment. I don't think that like was completely I don't think that's completely unfounded. Like there definitely were atrocities and abuses committed, like especially in Central Asia by the Soviets. But like it still was like a decision that definitely had consequences. And like was it really like for the best? Like I mean, it's in a way it's a shame because like people like Bill Casey like don't really care. Like it's all, and I think that people and the same could be said for China, and really the same could be said for the Soviets. They don't really care. Like they see this religion as a tool, and I think maybe even King Fahd is the same, where he just sees it as something that's a tool, like to be used like as a wedge for geopolitical purposes. But it's the whole.
I like that. I like that take on it. So it's just that like religion was the real casualty of the 1980s on all sides.
Yeah, well, the whole like religious landscape of like the future like is really like kind of unfolding like in this process of like these decisions to like end the Soviet Union basically. Like the decisions that are being made like are creating like and almost everyone is implicated, and and there really is like a religious sort of symbolic dimension to like a lot of this stuff, especially like in the interaction between through agents such as Casey, through like their networks. You can see like the sort of religious dramas playing out, the interaction between Islam and Catholicism, and basically all the components of like the religious landscape and the issues that we see like today, like all the seeds of them are all there. Like there's no dimension of like, for instance, like the outlook that Muslims have in the world now that isn't being sort of laid or isn't bound up in some way in this process.
I mean, especially if you look at the Iranian Revolution as kind of the kickoff of like this very formidable decade in the kind of reorganizing of the role of religion in various societies around the world and being driven by like geopolitical and various kind of like economic and military and even like ideological concerns. I mean, it is interesting that you have basically at the heart of this like a covert Abrahamic alliance of like right-wing Catholics, right-wing Israelis, and like right-wing Wahhabi, like, you know, Saudis, and then I guess, you know, the Pakistanis as well. Basically all kind of like, and the Egyptians,
is also like a fucking player in this as well.
Exactly, and then even I don't know the sort of neo-Confucian Chinese in a way. I don't know if they're really repping necessarily a religion per se. I wouldn't even say they were repping Maoism at that point.
They certainly are like engaged in like religious concerns, like, you know, the situation like in Xinjiang, like you can see the seeds of it like being laid, and it plays like a role in all of this, like the whole idea of like Central Asia as being the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, and now it's something that's played such a huge role in the, you know, foreign policy of the United States, and in the self-image also of the United States, and like the, you know, narrative of a U.S. empire in the 21st century is, you know, it's really fascinating.
And I think what did Bill Casey say there earlier about like how the Soviet Union is the last multi-ethnic empire, and like nationalisms
which is weird because it's like, wait a minute, like what about the United States? But I guess maybe he didn't see it that way. You know,
we are. I mean, white supremacist kind of settler colony.
Exactly.
So it's
like,
different. In fact, it's kind of a nice credit that he's giving there to the Soviets. A little bit, but the idea that, you know, nationalism is going to be resurgent, and basically, multi-ethnic empires are kind of like weak and prone to subversion, and there's this wave coming. And I mean, I don't know if that was just his intuition or what, but he was kind of right about that this like nasty wave of nationalism came to the fore and played a large role ultimately in like destroying the entire like Soviet bloc and the Warsaw Pact countries, and now has manifested in things today where, you know, Poland is kind of like this like right-wing Catholic like nationalist country. You see what happens in Hungary. You know, you got like Russian kids running around being like neo-Nazis, which doesn't make any sense, but it's like, or, you know, Ukrainians, like just Ukraine in general, like, you know, like, is that an improvement really? All those Bandera statues that they're putting up everywhere, and their little, you know, Jews will not replace us, like torch rallies that they have all the time, that like the last 3 presidents now have intimately pretty much supported. In the U.S. So, you know, it's like it's kind of like a dystopian. I don't know, but
it's also an interesting comment by Schweizer in calling like King Fahd like, you know, shrewd but also like naive, like in, you know, in many ways. And I think that there was kind of a calculus that, you know, the Soviet Union, they had all sorts of, like, you know, policies that, you know, were, like, you know, obviously not, like, conducive to, like, you know, the practice of Islam in that area. I don't necessarily think that, like, the Saudis, insofar as they were, like, hardcore Salafis, like, really were, you know, it's hard to really believe they were that invested in, like, the, you know, support for Central Asian Islam, except insofar as they could, like, somehow exert control over it, or, like, protect themselves from Iran. You know, I think that was, like, also a thing. But
that comes in big in that conversation I think Fahd had with Casey. You know, he basically the thing he wanted to like always talk about whenever he met with Casey was like the defense shield that basically had been promised by the U.S. to the Saudis. I'm trying to find the name of it,
stingers,
but
right? The quote.
He wanted stingers,
Right. He said it says Fahd, deeply naive in some ways, but intensely shrewd in others, did not want just talk. He wanted something tangible from the president to let him know he could rely on Washington. right? So I think that, and there's like Prince Bandar was asking Secretary of State Schultz for a formal written clarification on the president's commitment, right? Yeah, we read this part, but just to like reiterate, you know, and he wanted the Stinger missiles, right? Like, so that to me like shows like there is like that uncertainty, like I'm throwing my lot in with a certain faction in this like ideological struggle, you know, like I see like the future, like my like ability to shape the future of like my country, like my religion, really, like, you know, as someone who's like the custodian of the two holy mosques, you know, like like that, you know, so, and this is all part of like a longer history obviously in Saudi, but yeah, it is you know, it's very because that you can see like that's where Muslims are now, like kind of caught between like really between like China's geopolitical orbit and the U.S., where like they don't like in kind of like between a rock and a hard place, really, where like neither side like is, you know, very partial to like, you know, this continuing, and at kind of at the mercy of like these same sort of people or their direct heirs, you know, who are like kind of, you know, still running the Muslim world in many ways, you know, or the same sort of faction or tendencies are present, you know.
No, for sure. Oh, I also just wanted to point out that that like, you know, it does mention here that like CENTCOM was established in so this is like in April 21st, 1981. Weinberger announced the Rapid Deployment Task Force, proposed by President Carter to develop a capability to deploy forces in the Middle East if necessary, would be dramatically upgraded and expanded. It would become a unified command with its own forces, intelligence, communications, and its own unified commander responsible for all aspects of U.S. military planning and operations in the Central Region. The new U.S. Central Command, U.S. CENTCOM, would be much larger than the RDF, boasting nearly 300,000 U.S. troops. It was a nice security blanket for the royal family and a unique venture that symbolized just how closely Riyadh was wedded to Washington for its security needs and how important Saudi oil was for America. The new command was not part of any formal alliance such as NATO, and it had no treaties governing its role. To soothe Saudi sensibilities about the political hazards of U.S. forces based on Saudi soil, the headquarters and forces for U.S. CENTCOM would be located outside the theater, and, you know, basically that was like a huge thing that brought, you know, the Saudis and whatever closer together, and also is like how, you know, how central, no pun intended, has CENTCOM been like in our lifetime as basically the main war engine in the Middle East, like after 9/11, and this all came out of Reagan administration, you know, trying to reassure the Saudis, who were absolutely terrified. I guess there was a underground Shiite organization called Al Dawa, the Call, that was, I guess, cooking up a plot to bring down the governments of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia shortly before the announcement of, you know, CENTCOM, like several months before. But American intelligence got a whiff of it through some electronic intelligence and tipped off Prince Nayef, the Saudi interior minister. And then later on, I wanted to say it was... what was the name? They had an even more explicit thing in the Persian Gulf that was like a defense shield. I want to say it was called like Desert Shield or something like that. That basically protected them and made them like impervious to Iranian attacks. And you know that.
Desert Shield. I don't remember. I do remember them mentioning CENTCOM. I remember them mentioning the Stingers, but I don't remember Desert Shield.
Desert Shield, I think, was an operation, a campaign at some point. Maybe that was like the prelude to the Gulf War. So it was named something else. But basically, that came a little later in the mid-'80s, and basically, you know, I mean, like, we basically provided the military as the Praetorian Guard for the Saudis, you know, in this stormy region. They wouldn't have to worry about getting couped or overthrown or invaded by Iran, and, you know, the Reagan administration was, like, very super about that.
Prosisz mnie znowu, który to już twój list.
jeśli tylko bym mógł. Jakie postępy poczyniłem na dziś w sztuce latania, najtrudniejszej ze sztuk. Co rano windą wjeżdżam prawie na dach. Jest tu w osiedlu taki najwyższy blok. Codziennie myślę, patrząc z niego na świat, co będzie, kiedy wreszcie zrobię ten krok. Ostatni krzyk, łabędzia nuda i dalej nic w teatrze lalek. Ogólnie mówiąc, life is brutal. Poza tym wszystko doskonale.
Yeah, before we move on to our topic, I just thought this one passage from 157 is a very interesting one that I think should be included in the earlier conversation here. So it's talking about, Casey's efforts to get sort of China on his side here. He says that the president, who had strongly backed Taiwan during the 1980 campaign, was beginning to see the merits of cooperating with the communist Chinese on several fronts. The enemy of my enemy is my friend was Casey's view of geopolitics. That had been the case during World War II, when the Western democracies had fought off the Nazis and the Japanese with the help of the Soviets. With just a little bit of a hand from the Soviets. Anyway.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, a slight assist, they were alley-oop. So for this reason, Casey wanted to work with them on Afghanistan. So there was already close cooperation between Beijing and Washington on a number of fronts. The electronic eavesdropping facilities along the Soviet border were proving invaluable. Technicians from the United States were secretly manning the facilities in the heart of Central Asia. We kind of talked about this a little bit. The Chinese were helpful in carrying out the Afghan program, providing Soviet bloc arms and other assistance. Casey briefed his host on the success in Afghanistan and the plans for the future. At the same time, there were growing tensions between Beijing and Moscow, particularly along the common border. The two communist powers were, among other things, fighting for the allegiance of the region's Muslims. The presence in Inner Asia of 45 to 50 million Muslims distributed between the Soviet Union and China had forced the two to devise quote-unquote Muslim strategies that were both defensive and offensive. The Soviets have been aggressively working to sow dissent and penetrate the Chinese Muslim populace. An agent named Nikolai Petrovich Zhang and two ethnic Chinese had recently been picked up for spying. Yu Zhonggui, a Chinese citizen, was jailed for anti-state activities. He had reportedly crossed the border from China into the USSR in 1980 and been recruited by the KGB. He had been sent back to China several times to collect political, military, and economic intelligence. The Soviet effort was tenacious, particularly as it coincided with the thrust into Afghanistan. Soviet propagandists were targeting the Muslim population of Xinjiang province, using radio stations in Tashkent, Alma-Ata, and Frunze to beam anti-Chinese messages in almost all the Turkish languages as well as Chinese. Until 1980, the odds in the fight for Muslim loyalty had been stacked heavily in favor of the Soviet Union. Moscow, so this is interesting because the sentiment today, with not for no reason, among Muslims is pretty anti-Soviet. This is interesting context. Moscow could offer a higher standard of living while China required greater ideological orthodoxy. But in 1980, two things changed to make the Chinese more aggressive and successful in their operations. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan provided ample ammunition to the Chinese claim that the Soviets were anti-Muslim. Propaganda broadcast from China into the USSR consistently played into that theme. At the same time, China made important concessions to Muslim minorities, including the suspension of anti-religious crusades and the reopening of old mosques. Salim Anshui, imam of the Dongxi Mosque and the chairman of the Islamic Association of Beijing, was invited to Islamabad and elected a member of the Muslim League. He had even approached the Saudis about building a new mosque in China. For Beijing, Islam was emerging as an asset, or at least a tool, to use against Moscow. So there's some more about Casey, but he was Casey said he steered his conversation with Zhu Kezhen, who is the assistant foreign minister in charge of relations with the United States, to the what the Soviets called the nationality question. Without being too direct, he hinted that the United States was running a propaganda campaign aimed at Soviet Central Asia, designed to sow dissent. Zhu said such an idea had merit and proposed possible cooperation. It's it's very interesting because it, like, as I said, like, the sentiment generally among Muslims in the West and elsewhere is pretty, like, anti-Soviet, and for good reason. Like, community leaders who disappeared, like, lots of bad things happened under the Soviets. However, like, it wasn't, like, necessarily the caricature that it's sometimes made out to be. And, like, even reading this book, which is not pro-Soviet, like, it's a really anti-Soviet book, one does wonder, like, if the calculations, like, had gone differently, like, how things might be. Because, like, China was sort of pressured by the presence of the strong Soviet Union to, like, make certain concessions. And the Soviet, like, they, like, whereas now, it's, like,
you're right, yeah.
A very bad situation.
That's one of many of the kind of real politic. It almost reminds me of the argument when people lament how, like, unionization rates have, like, collapsed in the United States, and it's like, well, silly, that's because there was, like, a looming threat of the Soviet Union there to at least, like, make capital a little bit nervous and want to give some concessions, like in the 1930s, to workers. And then, as we saw, like, as soon as that grave challenger, like, left the historical stage, they just, like, it turned the neoliberalism knob up to 11 and started privatizing and basically doing whatever the hell they wanted to. So it's like, even if you're and probably a decent amount of people listening to this are rather sympathetic to the Soviet position. But, like, even if you're not, even if you don't necessarily think they were perfect, or they had fallen into revisionism, or even if they were, social imperialists or something like that. I mean, the tricky thing is, because China and the PRC and the USSR were constantly accusing the other of kind of being, like, revisionist and social imperialist, it's hard to kind of, like, support all of them equally. It's like, so was somebody right in all of this, or all these people just wrongly calling each other revisionist? But you can see just, like, the existence of the Soviet Union, whatever flaws it may have had, provided certain levels of stability and made other large powers in the world have to sometimes give certain concessions, or not bring down the hammer as hard as maybe they would be want to do today, when there just simply is kind of, like, no alternative. I guess if you're a Muslim in China, what is kind of the alternative? Like, to become a war-torn, like, U.S. backed, like, breakaway state or something that gets, like, invaded by mercenaries, or, like, you're in this other situation, but China doesn't have I mean, now it's just there's a bunch of small, not very powerful majority Muslim countries on its border, instead of which obviously have connections to Russia, but
yeah, like, it kind of puts the lie to this idea that, like, when you see all these people who, like, their predecessors, like, King Fahd, and, like, now we have MBS, like, he was like, oh, we need to do, like, when Casey came to him and was like, we're going to create this, ecumenical alliance of, the anti-communist Christian U.S. and, like, these Muslims to defeat the atheistic Soviet Union, and, like, their, like, policies toward religion were often, like, very heavy-handed, like, as I think he says, probably rightly, not perhaps as much as China, but, definitely, like, were problematic in many ways, but it's kind of puts the lie to that whole idea when you see, like, what's going on now with the, like, direct, descendants, like, sometimes actually, like, biologically, or, their political descendants, where they're, you know, they are rolling over for China. Like, they can't say anything. Like, they, you know, like, people know
that's true. They have said basically nothing. They haven't joined. They are not a part of the new kind of, it's really more like the secular, neoliberal, humanitarian imperialists that are, you know, making the most noise. Which, again, makes sense. Like, it aligns with their objectives and what they're after to do this. But then you see when it's, like, not in Saudi Arabia's immediate interest to do that, you know,
it's nothing new under the sun, where, like, it's the same thing of saying, like, oh, you know, like, you know, pointing the finger at, like, who's anti-Muslim because, like, it benefits you, in the same way that, like, you have the Soviet Union and China going back and forth, both of them being officially atheistic. Probably neither of their leaderships thinking very highly of Islam or Muslims, but of course, like, they're willing to accuse, like, I mean, you know, the people who, like, you can see flags at, like, Uyghur flags waving at, like, Trump rallies or things like, you know, things like that. Like, you know, they...
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, but, like, you know, none of the people, like, who... I think that Donald Trump himself, like, ideologically, and, like, the people around him, as well as, like, most, you know, politicians in America in general, like, you know, don't think very highly of Islam, you know, at most, if they don't, like, you know, fear it, you know, but they're still willing to, you know, use it, like, in the same way, you know, like, even if they would like to have it wipe out the face of the earth, like, they're still, you know, so it's really, it's a nothing new under the sun situation, but, like, in the new sort of geopolitical landscape, these people who, like, threw their lot in with the United States, like, you know, you can kind of see how they're reaping what they, you know, or they're not reaping anything. They're fine, but, like, the Muslim
Saudis are fine,
the Ummah,
unfortunately.
The Ummah is reaping what they sowed, you know, so.
No, for sure, for sure. It's a sad thing. Maybe we'll talk a little more about Afghanistan for a second and, like, the Stinger missiles and stuff, which were something that the Saudis were very, you know, adamant about asking the Reagan administration for. And there was, like, a lot, just as there was, I think, calls, there probably were calls during the Syrian war, basically to give, you know, what do they call them? Man pads to, which is, you know, more the modern version of the Stinger to, like, you know, al-Nusra Front and stuff. And there were the same concerns at that time where, like, even within the CIA or, you know, the Pentagon, there was nervousness about, like, you know, those getting into the wrong hands and things like that. And, like, it turned out that it really was more, I don't know, like, the entire training paradigm of the Mujahideen that, like, got into the wrong hands, or maybe it never got out of their hands to begin with. And, you know, there's that whole thing. But I just want to mention a little more, like, touch on a little more, like, the economic warfare side of it and how this was, like, deliberately engineered. I noticed that a lot of the people in the Reagan White House were coordinating with people on Wall Street and corporate heads and think tanks like the Rand Corporation to, like, figure out how to, like, give a death blow to, like, particularly the Polish economy in the early 80s when this martial law stuff is popping off. And this is on, I believe, let's say page 69. Or maybe it's not on 69. It's on 70-something. Anyways, I have it here. While Casey had been putting together his covert action plan for Poland, Caspar Weinberger had assembled a team of economic experts in the Pentagon. Held under the auspices of the Rand Corporation, it was sort of a classified gab fest to formulate a strategy for virtually killing off a Polish economy already in poor health. Fred Ickel, Undersecretary of Defense, called in economists Henry Rowan and Charles Wolfe, old hands at Rand, and a few trusted outsiders, including Roger Robinson, then vice president at Chase Manhattan Bank. Poland was already faltering on meeting loan payments to Western banks. The all-day conference, therefore, focused on the benefits and costs of throwing the country into default. A strong case was made for doing just that, potentially pushing the entire Soviet bloc into a financial crisis. According to Robinson, quote, the Pentagon was of a mind to do this. But the banker from New York argued strongly against such a move. there is a better than even chance that throwing Poland into default in this manner would actually relieve pressure on Warsaw to expend critical hard currency. A default initiative might also benefit the Soviet Union, Robinson argued, particularly if it was perceived in financial markets as a political move by Washington. There was also the possibility that a sudden Polish default could set off a worldwide chain reaction. Ironically, writing down, if not off, the $28 billion Polish debt might encourage the myriad of other troubled debtor nations to seek the same solution. Robinson added, playing out a politically driven default scenario involved the prospect of instant replays of sovereign default throughout the world, beginning in Latin America. For those of us crafting the Polish debt rescheduling in 1981, it was quite clear that it was a harbinger of the international debt crisis to come. And so I guess, you can see right there that there's like high-level coordination going on, basically to like inflict the maximum amount of damage and coordinate it so that it does not redound in any way to the benefit of the Eastern Bloc powers, which, I guess all is fair in love and war, but that has a real material impact, and I guess it did. So I guess what they did was kind of not, I forget exactly what they let me see what they ultimately ended up doing. They ended up slapping sanctions on them, and I don't think they forced them into default, but maybe just let them bleed out a little bit longer. I guess this was part of a larger strategy to basically cut off the Eastern Bloc from Western technology companies and also from banks and things like that. And I guess another really big plank, I don't know if I mentioned in the beginning, was the denial of advanced technology that the Soviets had been purchasing throughout the 1970s. Usually not through, but they couldn't purchase it directly from the U.S., but they could purchase it from European countries or neutral countries. And so that's kind of what they were doing. And a lot of this had to do with nuts and bolts, heavy industry. In particular, the something that surprisingly is still a hot topic today, which is the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it
and
is.
you found an article from just this last December that was about. It's interesting. I'll just read a little from it because it's interesting, how exactly the same it is to the fight over the Nord Stream pipeline in the early 1980s. So this is from December 21st. Russia cries war as U.S. tries to kill Nord Stream 2. The widening U.S. sanctions on the Russia-led natural gas pipeline project Nord Stream 2 are a kind of hybrid warfare used by the United States, Vladimir Putin's press secretary Dimitri Peskov said on Monday. Quote, "This is indeed a variant of hybrid warfare. It is used as a hybrid war by the United States," Peskov said. Asked about if the Kremlin agreed with a previous statement by Russian businessman Oleg Deripaska that the sanctions were hybrid warfare. Quote, "Let's take the sanctions against Nord Stream. It is a pure hybrid war that goes on like a war accompanied by unfair competition. The U.S. continues to try to kill the project by slapping sanctions on anyone or any company helping the pipeline in any way. U.S. sanctions have delayed offshore construction works as the United States looks to thwart the completion of the pipeline by broadening the scope of the sanctions against service providers and those funding vessels involved in the construction of Nord Stream 2, and including the project as a target of more sanctions in the U.S. defense bill. However, work off the coast of Germany, the endpoint of the pipeline, resumed earlier this month, with the pipe-laying vessel Fortuna laying a 2.6-kilometer section of the pipe. And potential new U.S. sanctions on Russia because of recent cyber attacks, as well as plunging oil prices because of fear of a new coronavirus strain, sent the Russian ruble to its steepest drop since March this year. And so this almost exact thing played out in the early 1980s with the Soviets. And so they identified right away that I guess the Soviet economy, the way that it was primarily set up in the Brezhnev years, was heavily based on exporting energy, exporting oil and natural gas. That was actually, I think, in the book it says 80% of their hard currency revenue came from selling oil. And of course, like since OPEC, basically, announced their embargo in 1973, all throughout the 70s, that's another reason why a lot of people in communist countries remember the 70s, the golden years, is because the price of oil was tremendously high, which hurt the United States, which was a heavy consumer of oil. It didn't hurt like the Texas oil billionaires and stuff. They had a boom. That's how like Mark Lombardi's Houston Museum got funded. But in general, it was a huge boon to the Soviets. And so their strategy going into the 80s was to build a natural gas pipeline that I believe would go through Czechoslovakia and then into West Germany, and then provide natural gas to Western Europe. So this was, they were like getting on board. They actually had two pipelines. They had the Nord Stream, and then they had a really big project known as Urengoy 6, which was going to be the most substantial deal in East-West trade history. And apparently, according to Schweizer, both Casey and Weinberger were, quote, obsessed by it. It was a natural gas pipeline running 3,600 miles from northern Siberia's Urengoy gas field to the Soviet-Czech border. There it would be attached to a West European gas grid that would dispense 1.37 trillion cubic feet of gas a year to a French, Italian, and West German consortium. It was originally configured to be a two-strand line, providing Moscow with as much as $30 billion per year in hard currency earnings. To a country with annual hard currency earnings at the time running about $32 billion a year, it represented vital economic life support. Quote, for Moscow, the pipeline was critical to its economic livelihood. It is hard to overestimate the value that Moscow placed on this project, recalls former senior staff member of the Communist Party Central Committee, Yevgeny Novikov. And Fred Ickel says it was a cash cow, plain and simple. And so, I guess, strapped for foreign exchange and without the technology to build and operate the pipeline efficiently, the Kremlin in 1979 looked to the West for help. The Europeans, anxious to develop an alternative to Middle Eastern oil, jumped at the opportunity when Moscow offered them 25 years of gas at guaranteed prices. In exchange, the Kremlin received a financial dream. As in the past, West European banks agreed to finance the purchase of pipelaying and other equipment, as well as construction at below-market interest rates, guaranteed by their respective governments. At the same time, other West European companies offered to sell the same sophisticated equipment in exchange for future shipments of natural gas. As it had the 1,700-mile Orenburg pipeline project, Moscow was using Urengoy 6 to raise credits in the West, in effect double financing at least portions of the project. And I guess it was Roger Robinson, the Chase Manhattan vice president, who was responsible for Chase's loan portfolio in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia, discovered this, quote, double financing scheme. In the late 70s, he was having dinner with a Soviet gas minister. He says, I asked the Soviet minister whether or not he supported borrowing money on the euro-dollar market to finance the project. He laughed and said, I would never take out such loans. The gas deliveries to Europe pay for everything. The Soviet Foreign Trade Bank apparently had failed to brief him adequately on its ongoing plan to double finance the bulk of the project, which further analysis proved to be the case. All the key Western imports were being financed through so-called compensation arrangements or straight barter, gas for pipe, gas for compressors, turbines, etc. And yet at the same time, the Moscow-dominated International Investment Bank was raising some $2.2 billion on Western credit markets in 4 jumbo syndications. Ironically, the loan documentation made clear that the proceeds were ostensibly to finance the purchase of pipe, compressors, turbines, etc. The arrogance was quite stunning. I guess Robinson told the CIA about this, but nothing happened. But then Bill Casey got a memo after that, and I guess it, in their view, this project would make Western Europe highly vulnerable to political threats of a Soviet shutoff of gas. Austria, Berlin, and Bavaria would be 90 to 100% dependent on Soviet gas deliveries, and they were not being very open with their own publics about this fact. One American banker recalls a private session in 1980 with the West German Minister of Economics Otto von Lambsdorff. He admitted to one of the participants that German dependence on Soviet gas could well reach 60%, not the ceiling of 30% cited in public. But don't worry, Lambsdorff said, the German public will not be informed of the true figure. So they set out basically, actually in an initiative to basically scuttle this deal somehow. They went around and basically tried to go to various European governments arguing for alternatives such as U.S. coal, synthetic fuels, and Norwegian natural gas. But the Europeans apparently weren't buying them. And I guess, Alexander Haig was willing to give up on it. But Casey and Weinberger, they thought the pipeline was too important to let it pass. And, they basically, set out on this mission. And they appointed I think his nickname was the Prince of Darkness, but Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Pearl, the wily defense intellectual who wanted to take a tough anti-Soviet line on everything. He brought CIA analyst Benson on staff and began hiring consultants to come up with alternatives. Some of the ideas were frankly absurd. One consultant claimed the Dutch were sitting on huge reserves and that Europe could be self-sufficient in natural gas. Another suggested a Trans-Africa pipeline from Algeria. Still another proposed a pipeline from Iran, Turkey, Greece. At the agency, Casey put analysts to work on various aspects. The Office of Soviet Analysis focused on the benefits to the Soviets of hard currency and favorable credit and on their ability to build the pipeline without outside help. I want to see where
It was really the Saudis they ended up going to, right? Like, that was a big sort of aspect of, like, their sort of the alliance they set up was the idea that, they would be able to have this oil supply from them. Like, prior to... this, like they really zeroed in on the Saudis as like an energy source, like a huge ally on that front, and like the whole the U.S.-Saudi alliance really cemented in during this period as part of this larger struggle for energy.
And that would be the second death blow of this energy aspect of the Casey plan is basically to persuade the Saudis, which took several years, but then in between 1985 and 1986, the Saudis finally consented to do this, which is basically to massively ramp up the production of oil in Saudi Arabia, so as to basically crash the global oil price, like the price of spot oil around the world. I believe they more than quadrupled their production by 1986, and actually for a variety of reasons, because of what it did to this was done semi-coincidentally with the U.S. devaluing the dollar, which allowed the Saudis to actually make money on this, even though they were cratering the global price, which basically that was a huge turning point in the Soviet Union that put a massive financial crunch on them, because it basically took away a huge source. I mean, we're talking about 80% of their hard currency earnings come through the sale of oil. And then the price of oil goes down, I want to say, it went down almost 2/3 or 75%. It absolutely collapsed, which also was a boon in the domestic political sense for Reagan. Because our economy was so heavily reliant on oil, even though maybe some of Bush's Texas oilmen didn't love it all that much, for most of the country, it was like getting a big stimulus. Gas was incredibly cheap all of a sudden. And so it led to a little bit of a bump in the mid 80s that probably, in Reagan's second term, that gave people, probably along with the massive deregulation and expansion of personal credit and debt, made everybody feel like it was morning in America. And it was that and the cocaine that Bush was bringing in, really contributed to things feeling like things were going great. But really what it was is this arrangement that the Reagan administration had repeatedly brought up to the Saudis as it would be really, really cool if you did this, and it would kind of help all of us in our greater objectives to undermine the Soviets by and also the other enemies as well, like Libya and Iraq, and Iran for that matter. Like all the other, because the Saudis had the most oil, so they were able to just pump out as much of it as they wanted and still kind of make a killing off of it. Whereas like all of a sudden Gaddafi didn't have as much money to play with, Syria didn't have as much money, etc. And that really was like a game changer, for the Soviets. It's hard to and at the same time, the other big thing was like denial of technology. So the U.S. started, I guess they hadn't been fully doing this, but like I read in that Nord Stream 2 article, they started doing this on like absolutely everything across the board. So you might think, okay, military technology, or computer technology was a big one that they went after, and particularly these kind of third-party companies. They basically started saying, if you're a technology company in the UK or West Germany or Norway or something like that, that you can't do business with the United States if you do any business with Soviet people or Eastern Bloc countries. So basically, we're making it illegal for you to go do business with the Eastern Bloc. And I'm trying to see here what the actual like embargo was.
While you look for that, this is an interesting part about what we were just talking about, like vis-a-vis the oil markets, that I think kind of illuminates some of what we were talking about. And it's interesting to read this like while thinking about like people in the recent administration in the U.S. like reading this book, because you can kind of see like how like I'm thinking about the orb picture and all that stuff, and like the terrorism, like anti-terrorism like center or whatever. So yeah, Casey is flying around in his a black unmarked plane, as we mentioned.
Did we mention that yet? That he repeatedly flew around in like an unnumbered jet black,
I think we
C-130,
did.
Like a DC-9
plane
or something.
Which
had a hotel, which had like a full hotel suite like built inside of it, so he could basically live on the plane and fly around covertly to all these different countries. So
Casey came to the Saudis bearing gifts. He and the Saudis, at the time, they were really afraid for various reasons. They were afraid of Iraq. They were afraid of Iran, as we mentioned. They were afraid of the Soviets too, that they would like try to come get their oil, because they when there was a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, they're like, oh, are they going to try to come into the Persian Gulf and take our oil? So, and in addition to that, everyone hates the Saudis, and for good reason. So, including, as you mentioned, factions. Maybe that wasn't the group that you mentioned, but there definitely were factions within their own country that hated them, and they definitely saw that something similar to what happened in Iran could happen to them. And they were looking to the United States to protect them. To save them. And Casey came to them and he gave them some intelligence on South Yemen. He said it was a present the prince has never received, says Schweizer. Transcripts of secret National Security Agency intercepts. South Yemeni officials have been receiving communiques about a band of Saudi separatists who wanted to help overthrow the royal family. There you go. The Yemenis had agreed to work with the squad, and they were being trained at a desert compound outside the capital. Casey gave the intelligence and the operation to the prince as a gift. No strings attached. Then he pulled out some other papers and slid them across the table. They were copies of CIA top-secret reports on Soviet oil production. They weren't anything fancy, and the prince probably had better intelligence on world oil production than anyone in the agency did. But they were a useful prop that would prove Casey's point. Moscow is financing its world empire through oil exports, Casey began. He had taken off his coat to get down to business. I wonder where all these flourishes come from, is Prince Turkey, telling Schweizer, then he took off his coat. Anyway, Turkey was eyeing the reports. They made a killing in the 1970s when the price went through the roof. Every time the price goes up $1 a barrel, it means $1 billion a year hard currency from Moscow. We can't afford to have that happen again. What Casey was trying to do was send the prince a message. No single world oil producer had a greater effect on world oil prices than Saudi Arabia. At the time, it accounted for 40% of OPEC's production. It also, unlike other producers, had ready, easy access to huge oil reserves. That meant it had production flexibility that would allow it to greatly influence world oil prices. There was an oil glut of 2 to 3 million barrels per day on world markets. A majority of OPEC countries were pushing for the Saudis to raise oil prices from 32 to 36 a barrel while cutting exports. By raising issues of oil pricing and U.S.-Saudi security relationship in the same conversation, Casey was in effect saying that the two were related. It was an element of the Reagan strategy. We wanted to lower oil prices, recalls Weinberger. That's one of the reasons we were selling them arms. The prince thanked Casey for the reports and mentioned in general terms that Riyadh had already announced a more moderate oil pricing policy. It serves our interest to have the U.S. economy recover, for you to be robust, strong, said Turkey. We will not be pushing for higher prices. Riyadh would resist any pressure to cut production and increase price, he assured his guest. After 3 hours, the meeting broke up. It had gone very well. Both men were pleased. Turkey had found someone who seemed sympathetic to all his requests and concerns. Casey had found someone who shared his anti-communist impulses and was willing to work with an America that had recently proved unreliable. Most important, perhaps, one of the cornerstones of the secret war against the Soviet Union had begun to be constructed. Saudi Arabia, vulnerable and fearing for its survival, was looking to the United States for security protection. The United States would willingly offer it in return for Riyadh serving Washington's interests in world oil markets. And of course, Schweizer notes that the black unmarked plane then took off and flew right to Tel Aviv.
So I mean, talk about doing the Abraham Accords like way back in the day, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
I mean, this is the real thing. This is breaking the kayfabe of the time. Oh, the Saudis and Israel don't like each other. But there he is, yeah. I mean that's the really like the number to keep in mind there.
The flight of the plane, belies all this black unmarked plane scooting around. It's the ultimate liminal.
It's like very
vector, subverting.
It's very
these,
like Aquino,
Yes,
yeah. Very. He's the devil, flying around.
Yes. It really is.
It's quite magical.
It's a broomstick. It's a broomstick.
Yeah. And that number though is like really important. So like for every single dollar change in the spot price of oil equaled $1 billion a year in hard currency earnings for the Soviets. So like I think by it going down like $60 or something was like $60 billion was like vaporized immediately. And just to then they were unable to basically build these two big pipeline plans they had set up at the beginning of the 80s for a couple different reasons, including the technology embargoes. And, they tried, just to give an example, here on like 82 and 83 of like how granular this strategy was. The intelligence analysis being done at the NSC indicated that cutoff of U.S. technology in the short term was critical to the pipeline project. Moscow had purposely developed a purchasing strategy for the pipeline technologies it would need from the West with the hope that the deal would therefore be embargo-proof. The Kremlin was signing agreements down to the subcontractor level to ensure that the Urengoy pipeline construction would go ahead despite objections from Washington. However, it inadvertently overlooked a critical link: the rotor shafts and blades driving the gas turbines for the 41 compressor stations along the 3,300-mile line. These parts were made by General Electric, which was now prohibited from providing them. The Soviets could find an alternative to the GE rotors, but the search would delay construction and increase costs considerably. A 30-member Soviet delegation based in Cologne was tasked by Moscow to find an alternative. It quickly identified Alstom Atlantique, a giant French machinery maker. It was the only other company producing the rotor blades and shafts, and they were under license to GE, based intellectual property. Cool. Getting approval for purchase of the French blades and shafts might prove pretty easy. In most European capitals, the agreements were fudged. The Europeans interpreted the NAC agreement, included in January 1982, that Europe would not undermine U.S. sanctions as covering only deals in which American companies were the main contractors, not where they served as subcontractors. So the French government gave the go-ahead to Alstom Atlantique to supply the technology to Moscow. Quote, it was evident between January and June of 1982 that the Europeans had dismissed the NAC agreement and had begun replacing U.S. suppliers at flank speed, recalls Roger Robinson. This despite a solemn pledge not to undercut American sanctions during the period of Soviet-sponsored repression in Poland. Additional intelligence reports confirmed that pipeline sanctions were coming at a time when they could have the maximum effect as an economic weapon. On January 25th, intelligence at the NSC indicated how serious the Soviet cash crunch really was. It included figures in Soviet bank deposits in the West compiled for the Bank and International Settlements in Basel. Soviet deposits in Western banks had fallen from $8.5 billion at the start of 1981 to about $3 billion at the end of the year. Soviet trade figures were equally dismal. In 1980, Moscow had experienced a $217 million trade surplus with the industrialized non-communist countries. But in 1981, that had turned into a $3 billion deficit. The gambit over Poland, pushing Moscow into the role of financial guarantor, had been timed perfectly. The financial markets would become much more cautious in their dealings with the Soviet bloc. You know, I mean, so you can see like the screws are turning now, even down to like the rotors that they need for the pipeline. It's like that type of shit. Like when we talk about, I don't know, when you talk about like imperialism and like how it's the little tricks that it does go down to this level of like kind of like it's not quite corporate espionage, but like, you know, extending its tendrils down to like the lowest level that like you cannot build this pipeline, even though like we technically shouldn't have the authority to decide what like Europe and like Eurasia do with like their, you know what I mean? I mean, it just kind of makes it very obvious.
Like, it's like like it's all about just having more dominance. Like that's, you know, both the means and the end is just being able to like exert like that level of control. And like that struggle like really continues, and
and I mean it's interesting to note that even super Putin's bitch, President Putin's bitch, who just left office today,
attack dog toy.
Last time I checked, that article is from December
poodle.
2020. Putin's poodle.
I'm trying to remember my names.
Vladimir's butt boy, etc. All the who could forget all those great names? But basically, you know, when
butt boy, the classic line.
But like when Peskov is saying that like the United States is engaging in hybrid war against us, who was president? Like, you know, during that it was like it was Trump. So like clearly there's like a continuity over the years of, and I remember this during the Obama administration. Most people, or a lot of people, like forget this, but I mean, really, both Syria and Ukraine, a lot of the beefs that kicked up, you know, if you wanted to like, you know, look beneath like the surface of the spectacle and look at the geopolitical things that kind of like catalyze these events, it was all about like pipeline projects. Like you remember there was that whole thing about whether or not Qatar would be able to build a natural gas pipeline, you know, through Syria, and Bashar said no, and then voila, there's like a, you know, civil war. In Ukraine, it was a similar thing. I remember following this big, you know, debate over like, I think it was the Nord Stream 2, I think, but basically a part of it like had to go through Ukraine to get into mainline Europe, and for a lot of similar reasons to why like the Reagan team was against it. They wanted to like, you know, basically, you know, that represented power and, you know, influence, and it would be connecting Russia more closely with the EU economy. And they basically, you know, I think part of the reason why they wanted to peel off Ukraine and make it like a pro-Western kind of EU country is so then they could be able to decide to not allow that pipeline to like run through Ukrainian territory. And it was when Ukraine rejected, I remember they both had like a deal, like Putin offered them a deal and the EU offered them a deal, and the US was pressuring them to take the EU one, and then they went with Putin, and then like 2 months later, like all these Nazis show up, and like you know, all these like Tim Pool Einsatzgruppen group and kids, you know, storm the Maidan, and you know, it's all hell. But you know, they're still being like, they're still trying to stop Russia from making this thing with Germany. Like even 2 months ago, they're still being like, no, we don't want Russia to become like the natural gas supplier to the EU. We don't want that. And so I think like even with a lot of the anti-Russia stuff today, like it's all really about, you know, these like kind of infrastructural, like, you know, kind of things, you know, and
energy,
you know, Russia will always be energy and oil, obviously. I mean, you know, and it's interesting that like Prince Turki pops up in this so much. He was the head of Saudi intelligence, and as much as anybody in the royal family has had like probably the most named person aside from Bandar as like giving money to like hijackers and like funding Al-Qaeda and like doing all these things and maybe doing 9/11. And you know, of course, that had all kinds of implications for energy.
Resigned, like right before 9/11.
Oh yeah, that's right. He did. Yeah, Turki bin Faisal.
Yes.
And you know, and those guys, I mean, those guys were kind of the young bucks in the 80s, like dealing with the Reagan administration and the Bushes and everybody, and in this like world anti-communist crusade that Bill Casey was kind of getting together. And you know, you have to wonder, I mean, this is another wing of the Contra enterprise and like the shadow world, you know, of maybe Mr. Global, if you will. I don't know. I mean, this is,
Mr.
you
Global,
know,
Mr. Galactic. Yes.
I mean, I feel like Mr. Global's lurking in the margins of this story. Whenever Bill Casey goes to Wall Street and gives like speeches where everyone's just he's like treated like a celebrity.
In a way, is Mr. Global. You know, he's literally like circumnavigating the globe, like in, you know, a matter of hours in his black jet. He is I mean, that's like where, like, I mean, you really like can see like in the movement, like how like these networks like operate and how like these places that are so disparate and that we never like consider in the same breath, like Poland and Saudi Arabia, like can be connected as part of this like a program, which really is driving like, you know, the whole like real policy and direction of like America as, you know, or United States as like a, you know, geopolitical entity. And I think that you definitely can perceive like the same sort of thing happening in like there's obviously we've talked about how like this has a lot of the seeds are visible in this story of the geopolitical situation today naturally, but you like but things obviously have also shifted around a bit, but you can kind of see the same things still playing out, you know, Saudi and Yemen. You mentioned the Abraham Accords, you know, but now maneuvering against China, like, and the huge concern with energy that, you know, has changed and now has taken on the sort of climate-related tenor, or at least the veneer of, like, climate concern. But under, like, that is, you know, a new sort of, permutation or facade for this you know fixation with this all important thing of the energy supply. You know, even in the kingdom, like in Saudi Arabia, like the sort of diversification of the economy and you know, the position towards Iran and the like even the nuclear deal. In a way, the Iranian nuclear deal that, like, you know, there's been a lot of like shuffling around on. Could be seen as having to do with this, because Iran really never wanted to develop weapons. Like, you know, it was about like the idea, like if they were going to develop anything, it would be for power. But you know,
I mean, it's funny how everybody knows what like the realistic deterrent effects of nuclear weapons are, but I feel like the entire discourse from both like Democrats and Republicans on like Iran or the DPRK having nuclear weapons, it's all predicated on the assumption that like these guys are fucking sickos and madmen and they're gonna have a bomb. You know what I mean? Like it's off that like Tom Clancy, like Sum of All Fears, like paranoia that these guys are nut jobs that are just gonna like lob an ICBM into like
they're
Riyadh.
Gonna destroy
when
Israel. You know,
they're gonna nuke
never
Israel.
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
No one is like
you're right,
they're
right.
gonna bomb, they're gonna nuke
right.
Saudi Arabia, they're gonna nuke those worthless Arabs. No, they're gonna destroy precious Israel. Like,
well, I'm sure the House of Saud is like terrified that would happen. But in terms of the public messaging, that is the sum of all fears is that, you know, Israel will be wiped off the map.
the whole idea that like Iran is like fanatically like desperate to build a nuclear weapon and like, you know, just really like foaming at the mouth to build it, like, is a lie. Like, that like isn't really true. Like, you know, like, not to say like, you know, there's nothing wrong with Iran, you know, like they don't do anything bad, but like just saying like that's false. That like they're just like frothing to build this nuclear bomb. Like, that's like just complete.
Of course.
Like, that doesn't comport. I mean, you could say like, you know, these tricky Persians, they're always lying, you know, like, but that's the level that it's going to have to operate on. The idea that they're like, you know, it's going to have to just
you know,
be like,
and
lying,
then also,
you know.
And the other mind-boggling thing about it is that everybody,
like, you know, they just hate those Jews so much, they just want that, but like, that's not like they've, you know, that's not what they've said. You know, so
of course. Well, you know, of course, the conflation of whenever anyone's saying like Israel will like be erased from the map, as in like it will cease to exist as like an ethno state in its current form, is always conflated.
Quote.
It's always conflated with like, no, he literally means he's gonna like nuke it until it's gone, and then it won't be on the map anymore. And of course, he never did say that. Also, that like there's a lot of like gaslighting going on in that it's pretty much an open secret and 99.99% confirmed that Israel has nuclear weapons. So like, nobody ever talks about that.
I mean, Pakistan, like, you know, is like they're pretty like right-wing Muslims. Like, they don't like Israel. Like, they have nuclear weapons. You know, nothing bad has happened.
Of course. But these framing devices are incredibly useful because they just
I mean,
they allow for the entire debate.
Yeah, there's plenty of things like what you mentioned, you know, like probably the most famous is like Marg Bar America, like things like that, you know, like saying like, you know, death to America, like basically like it means down with America, but it's like, oh my God, like they want to kill
They want to kill every one of us.
Like, well, it's just like your like it's absurd, like, you know, but like this whole idea, and it's always been like, they're about to get it. Like, they'll almost certainly have it, like, any second now, you know? Like, if we don't stop them, if we don't, like, assassinate all their scientists, they're gonna get it, you know? Like, and they've been saying that since the 90s, you know? But never has this actually materialized, I guess, you know, just because of our brave troops. That's all that stopped it. Not that they haven't actually been trying. You know,
gaslighting people, maybe should we just talk a little bit about the importance of the Strategic Defense Initiative and the role that played in all of this? Because I mean, our boy LaRouche, you know,
it was all his idea, yes, as we know.
Even though I think we said his name does not appear in this book, but and you know, I think a lot of mainstream historians would say that LaRouche kind of like, you know, falsely inserted himself into this narrative and whatnot, but I don't know. There's some pretty eccentric figures in the Reagan administration, and it would not shock. And by his own, I don't know, like the things we read in the LaRouche episode, like he offered his services to the CIA in like the mid 70s. So he seemed to be pretty down with working with like the military intelligence establishment. And I don't know, like regardless of what, like, you know, to what extent this is like all due to him, Reagan certainly became enamored with this idea of the SDI and basically, you know, he gave a very famous address about it, I think, where he had like pictures and stuff. And I remember hearing about it when I was like maybe in high school. Maybe we learned about it, and my first impression that I got from kind of the mainstream narrative is like, how wacky, like the SDI, like Star Wars. And I learned that, you know, the media, like the liberal media, kind of made fun of him for proposing this like SDI thing. But I don't know if like just sort of like dismissing it as like a wacky old man Reagan kind of a pie in the sky thing and calling it Star Wars, which even that has its own weird resonance with like the movies and I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know,
like
I'm
why was it called Star Wars?
You know, I feel like, especially on the heels of our recent UFO-related episode, I'm thinking about, you know, the connection between that, especially that UFO people often draw, between, like, you know, Reagan's dream, as the most famous statement of Ronald Reagan in the UFO world.
Oh, like how quickly our differences would dissolve if faced by an alien threat.
Reagan impression. Holy shit.
I mean, we just watched the movie the other day.
Yeah.
I sometimes think. Yeah.
Exactly.
He just that creepy saccharine thing.
Yeah. You know, maybe, yeah, exactly. That he, maybe it was all for that purpose. I guess Stephen Greer would say that it was so that he could, hurt the ETs who were just taking it and turning their cheek. But, you know, I guess so. More realistically, it was to PSYOP the Soviet Union, I guess. But,
yeah. Well, it does seem to be, I don't think Schweizer goes so far as to say that, like, the SDI was, like, fake. Like, there was research put into it, but in terms of the imminence of, like, how quickly, it's kind of like, you know, 4 years ago when Uber's like, we're going to have self-driving cars, like, next year. And then everyone realized they just drive around and kill people and, like, aren't smart at all and you can't use them. It's kind of like a little bit like that. Like, okay, yeah, maybe in the medium term we could, like, develop this. But you know, he announced this. It, like, severely triggered the Kremlin and and people in the Warsaw Pact, and then, you know, he went on. I think in 1985, he just started signing SDI collaboration agreements with Britain, and then in '86 with Germany, Israel, Italy, and Japan, and started, you know, making it kind of like this international research program. You know, like marshaling all the technology from these like relatively advanced, industrial, you know, nations. And this was like very, very, this is also when, you know, the Soviets had like 3 leaders die in the course of like 3 years, which was really not great timing for given what they were facing. You know, Brezhnev died, I think he died in 1982. And then, why am I blanking on Andropov? Yeah, Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief, who was like only there for maybe a little over a year, and then he died, and then Konstantin Chernenko took over for him, and he spent most of his time in ill health, kind of working out of the hospital, and then in 1985 he died, and then we ended up with Gorbachev, the young hotshot 54-year-old reformer. And, you know, I guess Gorbachev was like very freaked out and was really adamant. I think when they had their first summit in Reykjavik in 1986, that was the core of Gorbachev's demands to Reagan right off the bat, was that you cancel this SDI bullshit, because this is dangerous. You're going to use this as like kind of an offensive shield to basically, start a war with us and then block any nuclear retaliation. It's unacceptable. And weirdly, I guess he recounts in the book, like, Reagan had a certain like idealistic dream about just the total abolition of nuclear weapons. He kind of he didn't personally like nukes. He thought they were bad, but and I think Gorbachev went there and like threw that proposal on the table, thinking it might prove too tempting to resist for Reagan. But then Reagan wouldn't give up. I think he entertained the idea, but then he wouldn't give up building the SDI anyways, and so they kind of left it at an impasse. And then Gorbachev ran back, and he gave public speeches like on TV around this time that said the SDI, the goal was to drive the Soviets into like kind of like a suicidal, self-destructive, very expensive arms race. And so he was aware that like they were kind of trying to lure them into spending all this money, but then they went and it says right here, as Soviet power was on the retreat in Poland and Afghanistan, this is around late 86, the specter of the American Strategic Defense Initiative continued to haunt the Kremlin. By late 1986, the project was beginning to show some notable technical successes. Funding had more than doubled since fiscal year 1985 to almost $3.3 billion in 1987. Several foreign governments had concluded collaborative research agreements with the Reagan administration, a particularly troublesome development for Gorbachev because it further legitimized the research program in addition to giving more brain power to it. The Kremlin was running a vitriolic public campaign against American allies, warning against cooperation with the SDI research program and stressing that the system represented a Reagan administration attempt to achieve world strategic superiority. But on a different track, and this is interesting, Marxist-Leninist and Soviet-backed, also grain of salt here, this is Schweizer talking, Marxist-Leninist and Soviet-backed terrorist organizations were launching military-style strikes against SDI research facilities and scientists across Europe. Between July 86 and March 87, 3 senior advisors to their governments who had participated in the secret cooperation talks were assassinated. On July 6, 1986, Karl-Heinz Beckhertz and his driver were killed by a remote-control bomb outside Munich. Beckhertz was the director of research at the Siemens Company, an SDI contractor. In 1985, he had met with U.S. government officials to discuss the possibility of conducting SDI research, and he had served as an advisor to the Bonn government during the SDI cooperation talks in Washington. A letter left by the Red Army faction at the scene of the crime indicated that Beckhertz was assassinated because of his involvement in these, quote, secret negotiations. Then a West German foreign ministry official, Gerold von Braunmühl, was shot dead by a masked gunman while leaving a taxi outside of his home. He was a principal advisor to Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher during the SDI talks. And the RAF claimed responsibility for that too, proclaiming in an apparent reference to the SDI talks, quote, "Today we have, through the Ingrid Schubert Commando, shot dead the secret diplomat von Braunmühl." Wow. I guess, and then there was General Licio Giorgieri of the Italian Defense Ministry, who was the Director General of the Department of Space and Armaments Procurement at the ministry, was gunned down by 2 assassins in 1987. He was a principal advisor to his government during the SDI talks. The Union of Fighting Communists, a faction of the Red Brigades, claimed responsibility for the attack. In a rambling 14-page communique, the group said Giorgieri, quote, was struck down exclusively for his responsibility exercised following the Italian adhesion to the Star Wars project. The letter closed with the words, "No to Star Wars." So that's kind of interesting. The sort of clicking the support left terrorism button in Crisis in the Kremlin, all over the place. And I think that I can't say for sure that yes, like the KGB did all that, but I wouldn't rule it out. In fact, if you're gonna do any kind of terrorism, I mean, not endorsing anything here, but targeting like rich people and people that work for defense contractor companies is like a sophisticated approach. Let's put it that way.
Yes, for others, for terrorists who are bad that we don't support. Yes.
There's a huge parallel there to like all of the Iranian scientists that have had very strange assassinations happen to them that are probably done by the Mossad over the last 20 years. People that are involved in the nuclear program. There's been a lot of those. So I guess this is not necessarily anything new, but it does. I think it does go to show that basically, that they were taking this threat incredibly seriously, and were kind of getting desperate. I guess also the KGB industrial espionage ops tempo really kicked off in 1986, around the time that the SDI was coming about. And
speaking of Israel, another thing that it kind of reminds me of is the Iron Dome. I feel like the Iron Dome, I've heard a bunch of times that it doesn't really work, or is mostly for show. I can't confirm that again because I'm not a weapons engineer, and I don't really know from the inside how well the Iron Dome works. But I've read persuasive arguments that it doesn't, it's not what it's touted to be, and it's kind of more of a theatrical deterrent than. I mean, I guess there's many aspects of security theater across all different contexts. So yeah, it definitely would be not something that's entirely unique. The whole,
this is also bad news for the Soviets when they were developing their next 5-year plan in 1985, and Gorbachev was somebody that I've put on my cabinet when I play Crisis of the Kremlin, the minister Besmertnych, who I think was maybe the defense minister. He said, when we were talking about SDI, just the feeling that if we get involved in this SDI arms race, trying to do something like the U.S. was going to do space programs, space-based weapons, etc., looked like a horror to Gorbachev. And I guess, Gorbachev wanted the centerpiece of I guess he had a special conference in June 1985 on scientific technical progress. As its centerpiece was a look at accelerating the development by updating the machine tools industry and modernizing computer technology, instrument making, and the electrotechnical and electronics industries. These were the catalysts of acceleration, uskorenie, and the critical sectors in keeping the Soviet edifice in place. He declared there that scientific and technological progress was the most important mission. And he said, this means above all the scientific technical renewal of production and the attainment of the highest world level of technology. And so at the time, they were also forming the 11th 5-year plan. And it gave very high priority for overcoming the perceived lag with the West in electronics. But the problem with that was that the best Soviet resources in the field are being directed towards military industrial work, and half of the machine tools were going to defense enterprises, which also employed the best scientists. At least half of all research and development expenditures were for the military, and the Reagan defense buildup, particularly its emphasis on emerging technologies, meant that more resources needed to be shifted to defense. General Yevseyev wrote in one military journal that the threat posed by emerging technologies would give the capitalists a surprise attack capability similar to the one posed by the Nazis when they invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Deputy Defense Minister General Garayev, in another article, held out Popkov, an old worker and hero in Simenov's The Living and the Dead, and as a model for the Soviet citizen. Facing a new capitalist threat, the public, it was hoped, would lament as Popkov did, quote, "In the last resort, I would have even given up this flat and lived out my life in a single room on bread and water so that the Red Army could have everything it needed." The party had promised never to let the capitalists regain military superiority, but by keeping their word, they would pay dearly. And so, Gorbachev, for his, he bought this notion that we would never be, militarily outdone. For him, I guess falling behind the U.S. in the military technology sphere threatened the superpower status of the Soviet Union. There was no other way, Gorbachev told the party faithful. The competition that has grown more acute under the impact of scientific and technological progress is affecting those who have dropped behind ever more mercilessly. For Gorbachev, SDI was an American plan to further burden the Soviet economy. Quote, the U.S. wants to exhaust the Soviet Union economically through a race in the most up-to-date and expensive space weapons, he told people on Moscow television. It wants to create various kinds of difficulties for the Soviet leadership, to wreck its plans, including the social sphere, in the sphere of improving the standard of living of our people, thus arousing dissatisfaction among the people with their leaderships. So, yeah, and so therefore the new 5-year plan called for more spending on advanced weapons, and as Gorbachev would later admit, the planned rate of growth for defense in 1986 through 1990 was almost 8% a year, twice the rate of national income growth. All told, defense expenditures would rise an astonishing 45% in the next 5 years. And Schweizer notes here, kind of pathetically, like, Gorbachev was looking to the West, in particular an anti-communist U.S. president, to ease up on the campaign against the Soviet Union. Well, Gorbachev, that's the thing. Like, when you're dealing with Bill Casey, he's not going to let up. That's the point.
Right.
So yeah, and then, and that was right around the same time. Oh yeah, chapter 17 I saw here. August 1985, a stake was driven silently through the heart of the Soviet economy, and when the Saudis opened the spigot and flooded the world market with oil, and jumping production from less than 2 million barrels.
Interesting imagery there. A stake. I guess that's a common sort of
right?
trope, but the combination of the gushing oil and the stake to the heart. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Yeah. So so these things were all happening at the same time, and so he made this gamble on like high technology. Like, we have no choice but to match this, and bumped up defense spending 45% over the last 4 years. But I guess you can't defend something if it dissolves and ceases to exist as a political entity, can you?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I get it. I don't want to be too snarky on, these late Soviets, but like, especially Gorby. I mean, I think that
you have a soft spot for him because he's been in your cabinet so many times, or maybe you're referring to the other guy.
No, I've repressed. I've put pressure on Gorby like periodically to keep him from rising in too much popularity. Right. I've never let him in my cabinet. That's dangerous.
Yeah, that's no
double goes for Yeltsin.
Terrorism. Yeah. Right. Double goes for Yeltsin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think also, the last thing, I do want to talk about Crisis in the Kremlin as it relates to this briefly at the end, but maybe we could also just talk about like Stinger missiles being like Schweizer, I think, makes a pretty compelling case that it was only in I think 1985 going into 86 when the U.S. finally assented to giving Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. And I think Schweizer makes a pretty big argument that like that really was the game changer for the war. They also, Reagan also signed like a national security directive. There were a couple of them that were increasingly aggressive, like NSDD 32 declared the United States would seek to neutralize Soviet control over Eastern Europe and authorize the use of covert action and other means to support anti-Soviet organizations. In November, NSDD 66, Order 66, declared it would be the U.S. policy to disrupt the Soviet economy by attacking a strategic triad of critical resources that were deemed essential. And in 1983, he did NSDD 75, which called for the United States not just to coexist with the Soviet system, but to change it fundamentally. And then he did another one in 1985 or 1986 that basically... here it is. NSD 166 in March 85 articulated for the first time specific objectives with regard to the Afghan war and put them in a strategic context. And the entire government foreign affairs apparatus would be directed to support the effort. And it had new elements. First, there was to be more effective supply and distribution of weapons to the Mujahideen. Special attention would be paid to supplying more advanced high-tech weapon system. At the same time, the U.S. intelligence community was directed to put more resources in collecting intelligence in the Soviet war effort. And a third... and then it was like putting maximum political pressure on them internationally to like shame them into basically to pull out. But I guess NSDD 166 proved a major watershed in the effort to expel Soviet forces from Afghanistan. Quote, you didn't have a major coordinated covert program until President Reagan came to office. This is Vince Canestraro, who served in the CIA in the 70s and 80s. You didn't have a computer response until 1985. NSDD 166 was the turning point in the war. It is hard to overestimate on that. Let's see. If you look at the military situation on the ground prior to 1985, you had a stalemate, but all they could do was wage a hit-and-run guerrilla war. They didn't have the high-tech weapons to turn back the Soviets. That soon changed with NSDD 166, and that is mainly because they gave them hundreds of Stinger missiles and then set up CIA training camps to train hundreds of Mujahideen basically to operate them. And I guess, the Stinger missile is incredibly easy to operate, right? And they actually, in a very kind of a proto-ISIS kind of way, they gave the Mujahideen a video camera and had them like film the first Stinger attack on a column of Hind helicopters that were approaching an airport to land. And I guess the video wasn't very good because the cameraman was jumping up and down, screaming Allahu Akbar when they first hit. I believe they took down 4 out of 8 helicopters in a minute or two. But then they
chill out. We say Allahu Akbar. It's not a big deal.
I'm just saying it's mentioned. It's mentioned in the book that they were screaming Allahu. This is the first video where you're gonna blow something up, and it's kind of a meme. It's an aesthetic that they're developing. And then this video was whisked back to America and personally delivered to the White House so Reagan could watch the first Stinger attack on these Hind helicopters. So so that
an interesting thing that he mentioned was that when the Saudis were asking for these Stingers because they were so afraid of these air incursions and from various powers, including from the Soviets themselves, they hadn't even given them to our really firm allies, in Western Europe and stuff, and so, they were giving them out as, an inducement as part of this operation, before, it was, a big ask, they really had to lobby hard for it, and Bandar was a huge part of it, the lobby for to get the Stinger missiles to the Saudis, and the Pakistanis also got them. so they could shoot down Soviet planes and such. Yeah.
Exactly. And, the Stinger missile, if anybody's not aware, like, it's basically like an automated heat-seeking missile launcher. It's a fire and forget weapon. So you basically can just, once you aim at your target and shoot it, you can just run away. Like, you don't have to, remain exposed. So it's very good for, guerrilla warfare. It has an effective ceiling in excess of 15,000 feet, carries a high explosive warhead, and races at 1,200 miles per hour. Uses a complex infrared heat-seeking detection system that, once it locks onto its target, is virtually impossible to distract with countermeasures. And so that basically means, with very minimal training, you could send some guy out in a valley or just camp him outside of an airport, and you can start shooting down, these high-end helicopters, which has been a central plank of the Soviet kind of war strategy there. So I guess in that first attack, they found a group of 8 Soviet high-end gunships outside of Jalalabad. They fired 3 missiles, one malfunctioned, but then the other 2 hit, and those helicopters, fell out of the sky. They shot 2 more missiles, knocked down 2 more helicopters, and this is a kind of a staggering statistic. But he writes that the potency of the wonder weapon was clear. Of the first 200 Stingers fired, 75% hit aircraft. So that's a pretty good success rate for any kind of weapon. That's 150 aircraft getting shot down for 200 out of 200 missiles that you give them. And so that basically that totally changed the vibe of the Afghan war from that point on. The air war became much harder to prosecute because both airplane pilots and helicopter pilots would drop bombs from higher up, which of course made them much less accurate. They would get in fights over not wanting to go on certain bombing runs because they think they would get hit by Stingers, and it increased the casualties a pretty great deal. And so that kind of makes a very that was kind of the real, up to that point it was kind of a toss-up whether or not the Soviets would kind of triumph in this. As late they were kind of having a surge. I think in 1985 they were bringing in a new hotshot general, and were using, they had their own kind of advanced technology like night vision and things like that, and could do these strafing attacks with everyone can remember from Rambo 3. That were pretty effective, and it's not to say that the Afghan government was a complete Potemkin government. I don't know. I think there are aspects of that government that would have been absent a civil war, were probably better in some ways. Maybe that's just my my Western chauvinist perspective, but it seemed compared to the Mujahideen kind of whole milieu. One thing that's funny here that gets mentioned very casually when they were training is that they would, when Brigadier General Mohammed Yusuf in the ISI was he would pick the Mujahideen candidates, and then they would go. Yeah, this is weird. The KC wanted the CIA to conduct the training, but the ISI refused. A simulator was brought in by the U.S. Army, and with the help of the local CIA, was set up at Ojiri camp in Rawalpindi, and Mujahideen commanders were brought in. A 3-week training course began immediately. 250 Stinger grip stocks were to be shipped per year with 1,200 missiles. And this is the interesting quote. Strike teams were organized to follow the new Stinger commanders. Once a plane was shot down, the strike team would finish off the pilot. It was a grisly task. After several months of training, the Stinger finally made its debut. So, I don't know. So, it's they're just talking, the CIA trained them to go and, murder the pilots when they would, if they were alive, when they got shot down.
They make pretty clear that, these commanders, were carefully vetted to be they weren't it's not everyone in Afghanistan who wasn't associated with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan or whatever it was called, was this, violent rural, maniac who was brutal, what would cut, would kill his own, would kill pilots out of the plane or whatever. it was, like, they were trained to do this, like, by the CIA.
I mean, this is classic, like this is School of the Americas.
But
this is Contra shit. This is Phoenix program shit. This is, and the psychological, just to say real quick, like the psychological efforts, they talked in the very beginning, like all the way from down. I think that had a psychological impact of like, this is what, do you really want to keep fighting? Because we're just going to like execute all your POWs and like cut their heads off and like, videotape it. Like, and that's a very CIA way of thinking, I think, more than it is like an indigenous resistance movement way of thinking. And, but even on the biggest level, they talk in the beginning of this book, he talks about how the crazy cowboy image of Ronald Reagan was something that they decided to lean into, and he even uses the word that it was a psyop. Like they said early in '81.
Same thing with Nixon. Yeah, like you don't want to play chicken with a madman or something. I think is what they say.
Or
like that,
it even makes you wonder about like Trump, about like what they, or maybe like people around Trump thought that like, hey, like you should act
Although
crazy.
I do feel like in Trump's geopolitical dealings, like he always was being like outsmarted. I think that like. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm falling for like his idiot act or like his playing dumb. But I feel like for instance, in his dealings with Erdogan, I always felt like he was getting like easily manipulated by him. Maybe like it worked on Iran somewhat. Like I guess maybe it did work on Iran somewhat, where like they didn't retaliate as heavily as perhaps they could have because they were afraid that he actually would inflict devastating losses on them. Maybe, I don't know.
It's possible. Yeah, but they said at one of their first national security planning group meetings in '81, it was decided the administration needed to begin a concerted covert effort to play on Soviet psychological vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So like mind war, basically. The Soviets were concerned about Ronald Reagan, whom they characterized as an unpredictable cowboy. And Richard Allen had met with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin during the transition. Quote, they thought they had some first-class nutball on their hands, recalls Allen. They were frightened to death. The new administration saw value in cultivating that image. It was part of Reagan's strategy to get the Soviets to think he was a little crazy, says Allen. This is a concept proposed by the late strategist Herman Kahn, who'd compared the superpower competition to the game of chicken. Neither side wanted to crash, went the theory, but neither wanted to back down when a confrontation arose. Yet ultimately someone would back down to prevent all-out war. As Kahn so succinctly put it, no one wants to play chicken with a madman. So the cowboy image had its strategic advantages. Born from this meeting was an informal but very intense psychological operation, parentheses, PSYOP, in all caps. The goal was to shape the Kremlin's thinking by putting it on the psychological defensive and thereby making it less prone to taking risks. This involved a series of military probes in the Soviet periphery. It was very sensitive, Fred Eichel recalls. Nothing was written down about it, so there would be no paper trail. Sometimes we would send bombers over the North Pole, and their radars would click on, recalls General Jack Chain, the former Strategic Air Command commander. Other times, fighter bombers would probe their Asian or European periphery. During peak times, the operation would include several maneuvers in a week. They would come at irregular intervals to make the effect all the more unsettling. Then, as quickly as the unannounced flights began, they would stop, only to begin a few weeks later. It really got to them, recalls Dr. William Schneider, Undersecretary of State for Military Assistance and Technology, who saw classified after-action reports that indicated U.S. flight activity. They didn't know what it all meant. A squadron would fly straight at Soviet airspace, and their radars would light up and units would go on alert. Then, at the last minute, the squadron would peel off and return home. The first PSYOP probes began in mid-February and were designed primarily to sow uncertainty and therefore deter a Soviet move into Poland. But the operations would be used throughout the administration as seen fit to send a psychological message to the Kremlin. And I guess later in the book he says after like having maybe the first summit with Gorbachev, Reagan sort of like I guess appreciated for the first time that like the Soviets really were paranoid that America was going to like attack them with nuclear weapons at any moment, and he like quietly told them to like stop flying bombers over the North Pole all the time, because he realized it was like, oh, I guess that does seem kind of dangerous, I guess. But yeah, you can see the kind of like this really is kind of like I don't know, it isn't interesting, like Mind War gets written and then the year later, like this entire decade, like everything this administration is doing is like a big laboratory for Mind War and just like total war, like on every single level, like economic, psychological, culture, political, military, just everything, you know? They were up against some real shit. And you know, I think
spirituality,
and weaponizing spirituality.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's really,
and
in the Aquino's domain for sure. Yeah.
So we start to wrap up. I mean, I just want to say, like, in preparation for this episode, I stayed up pretty late last night playing through Crisis in the Kremlin, which I've brought up before, and tried to apply the lessons of this book to my strategy to basically defeat Bill Casey. Because that when I play that game now, that's what I think. I can like feel the presence of the Reagan National Security Council like breathing down my neck, and it's interesting how like this book syncs up. So like it's maybe a testament to the game more than to the book, that like the major events that happen that fuck you over in the game are the ones that are highlighted in this book. Like basically, you know, you have a decent amount of money and revenue coming in, but then at the end of 1985. You know, the on the next turn, basically the Saudis like take the price of oil, and like a huge chunk of your treasury just goes away. So suddenly you have to like spread your resources way more thin, and then at the same time like there's trouble in Poland. Like you have to keep arming the military in Afghanistan. You have to you almost don't even have time to support third world revolutions, though you can go that route if you want to, but I played through it last night, and you know I at least got through the end of this book. I think I got to the beginning of 1988. I was playing with a kind of a custom general secretary character that I created that is kind of like a Stalinist Trotskyist hybrid is the best way to describe it. So for the first time So right now, like the Stalinists and the Trotskyists kind of form.
Hybrid seems. Oh, okay. They formed.
You know, they're kind of they have like a majority coalition. I banned the moderates, so like the minority party is the conservatives. Maoists and technocrats are being pressured, so they're out of the picture. And you know, I guess it opens the door for you to do certain things. Like I've appointed myself generalissimo of the armed forces, so I have stronger loyalty with the army. But because I have a Trotskyist background, the intellectuals like me more. It's funny how that always goes. And then so there's certain things like I've tried to invest. I want to develop OGAS, the cybernetic central planning kind of technology, but it's quite expensive, and I for the first time, because I'm sort of a quasi-trot, I'm able to support left terrorism in the U.S., which hasn't really seemed to have any effect yet. Like I haven't gotten much pushback, but still the same problems apply if you start to foment too much revolution in like third world countries. You'll get backed into a situation where you either have to, risk war with the U.S. or call a detente, which lowers your political power points, makes you look like a punk. The KGB loses respect for you. It's really bad. But I've been able to like make it, and I was able to blunt by inviting Libya into Comic-Con. I've basically been able to mitigate the oil drop. But I keep getting, it keeps prompting you with all this SDI stuff. So I've assiduously avoided falling for the Larouchian psyop that, SRI, I should pay any attention to it whatsoever. So I'm investing in new domestic, like industrial technologies and science and things like that, but I'm completely ignoring the SDI. I'm just acting like it's fake news. It's not real. And so far I'm making it, I mean, it's a very hard game to like survive, into the 90s, like intact. I have some loyalty issues with some of the republics, but since I'm generalissimo, I can send in the military to eliminate disloyal people and prop them up with finance and things like that. But it is challenging, the Afghan war, I kind of like backed off and did like negotiate. I think I put Najibullah in charge of Afghanistan. So then, he formed some kind of coalition government with like moderates. So it's not full communism in Afghanistan, but also like, it's not, fully Operation Cyclone owned
I mean,
either.
It was definitely like a mistake what they did in Afghanistan. I mean, a lot of their Central Asian policy was, left a lot to be desired, to say the least.
Sure,
I think that,
sure.
I mean, their vulnerability, the vulnerability that William Casey perceived in Central Asia probably would not have been as easily exploited if not for their own missteps in terms of the war. Would you say? I don't know. Let's.
I would say to a point that is definitely true. I mean, I think that the thing that like Brzezinski and everybody was salivating about from the very beginning when the Soviets moved into Afghanistan was like, now we can give them their own Vietnam. And so to that extent that it opened up the opportunity for, both on a messaging level and just like you're naturally gonna piss some people, you're gonna piss some groups of people off, like by intervening in this country, even though I mean, not to say, the people's People's Afghanistan government or the Democratic Afghanistan, whatever, that was supported by the Soviets was like all good or all bad. I think it was like I can understand. I don't think it was like evil for them to like want to support this government, which was being like attacked by various like kind of like reactionary factions, like trying to overthrow it and stuff. Like I understand why they wanted to stand up and like help, this like struggling nascent like socialist government and everything. But I do think when they got like sucked deeper into it, it ended up being I think as one Soviet official said around 86 or 87 that it was like a bleeding wound that I think when they got into it, they didn't anticipate they'd be dealing with like 4 or 5 other existential crises during this decade. And I think as it went on, and also, that they didn't know that Ronald Reagan and crazy Bill Casey, wild Bill Casey, were going to be running the show, and we're going to give Stinger missiles to these guys and all that stuff. I think they thought that, surely like these bandits, that was the language they would often use, like these terrorists and bandits that harass our forces. Like obviously they couldn't win against us. So in a way, I don't know. They thought that a kind of low grade pacification campaign would sort of do the trick, and they got sucked into this like bigger and bigger thing, which then kind of exposed the soft underbelly, and it did give the Arab world, like, which I think that almost in a way is like equally important aside from the context of like Muslims in Central Asia, but like the way that the Arab and Muslim world looked at the Soviets after 1980. Yeah. Because there's certain things like for example, like in this in Crisis in the Kremlin, there are several opportunities where you can kind of break with like certain segments of the Muslim world and support them against other, like you could kind of pick if you want to back Iran or Iraq in the war, and then that kind of has a determination on how other countries in like the Muslim world kind of react to you. And I think they kind of did themselves. It was an unfortunate timing when they probably could have used more support from like in Iran, or I mean they had Syria, but that was kind of about it, or Egypt, or other countries like this, and continue to make more like inroads in like South Yemen, another example. But like it just was not great timing. Yeah. I think we'll probably do another episode like even deeper dives into like Afghanistan, because there's like a lot of moving parts. I mean, like I'll give them a little bit that like there was like some realpolitik like concerns in terms of like the like pressure from Pakistan and things like that, I suppose. But that government was really bad. Yeah, and it was there like were lots of issues there. But that's my take on the matter. The Afghan government of the late 70s. They did come to power like by assassinating, I think. Was it the king?
They did assassinate him. No, he was like kind of like a pro-Soviet like relative. Yeah, he was a king. It was the king, but he And I guess like or was it the like yeah, I guess so. Like he was like yeah, he was the king. Mohammed Zahir Shah, was the last king of Afghanistan, was killed. Yeah.
What was the?
Yeah, I feel like.
Yeah, well, I mean, what was the of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan? I guess that was the official name of it from 1978.
Yeah.
What was so? I mean, because you know there's some nice things, and I don't want to get into that game of like they let women go to school, so like they were better, but like you know they did offer a lot more in terms of equal rights to women, universal education, land reform. Things like that. I think that's what it was. I'm looking at it right now. There was a power struggle between two factions in this original revolution, which I think was kind of the Tsar revolution, which ousted Muhammad Daoud Khan, and I guess there was the Khalq faction and the Parcham faction, and it was Amin and Taraki. And Amin had Taraki killed. I mean, I hate to read fully from Wikipedia, but then Amin was assassinated by Soviet military forces. I'm not seeing any footnote for that, but I don't know. There's a lot of... Yeah, I mean,
they were, like, in the, like, you know, in the sort of build-up to, like, the war, there were a lot of, like, brutal incidents, like, I'm thinking of, like, you know, my, like, academic work is kind of on early modern Herat, so I've heard about, like, the Herat Uprising, I believe, is...
1979 Herat Uprising.
Was that it? Yeah, like, it was, like, a very brutal event, and, like, a lot of, you know, many died, and, yeah, there similar situations to that occurred, like, kind of in the lead up, like to the war, or to the Soviet invasion, in like, you know, around the Soviet sort of support for the government. There were a lot of sort of brutal suppression of. You know, in a way that was, you know, not chill, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, like, I'm not a super big expert on, you know, this by any means. So, you know, I'm sure that there's, like, ideologues on, like, either side who could, like, you know, make the argument either way. But, you know, yeah, I feel like there's definitely some fault there, I would say. Yeah.
It was. I think it was. Yeah, it was imperfect. Not the. Yeah, there was a lot of messiness going on, and I think even for Afghanistan, which had a very like decentralized, and still kind of to this day, has like in terms of like a national culture, it's like it's quite decentralized, right?
Like I mean. It's almost like hyper-centralized, I guess, in terms of, like, you know, like what, like, yeah, I mean, there's a, I don't know, what like, explain.
Well, I don't know if it's hyper, I mean, well, I mean, like, there's like, obviously, like, a citadel of, like, power in Kabul, but I know I've read this over the years that like you know almost like the power doesn't extend past the capital. It's like there's still a lot of like you know there's warlords and kind of like tribal sort of chieftains and like things like that.
There's
and
still like a little bit of like tribal sort of in terms of like in rural areas and things like that. There definitely is. That's kind of what I mean in terms of like there's like you know, local locuses of power in that way. I guess that's a form of decentralization. But that's, you know, in, like, rural places, that's still, like, the case. But, yeah. You know, again, like, not a huge expert on the landscape of modern Afghanistan, but, like, in urban places, like, you know, it's not, you know, something that's, like totally like ruled by warlords or whatever.
Oh no, for sure,
that's not really been the case in the past. But yeah,
And yeah, so we'll come back to Afghanistan in the 80s one of these days, and I think actually like examining kind of the challenges like leading up to the Soviet intervention would be really fascinating because
yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that would be interesting
because
again,
it's kind of like the Sino-Soviet split. It's like a lot of these guys ended up like killing each other and kind of like taking over, like Karmal and Amin, and so I don't know, like somebody had to be right and somebody had to be wrong, right? I mean, or
I guess that's
or
true.
Or it's too simple to say that they're all like evil commie like sickos who just like whatever blah blah blah. I mean, I guess we'll have to see.
Well, yeah, I guess especially when both sides, in terms of Sino-Soviet split, I guess both sides were like commie sicko. Well, you couldn't really brand one side one way or the other. I guess, although maybe the argument would be they're just both such sickos that they couldn't get along because like they were too like sick. I don't know.
I don't know. Well, apparently, China wasn't so sick that they couldn't help us build listening stations, and
they weren't.
All over the place.
I mean, it's my friend. Yeah, but no, that's like a big sticking point for me with the Soviet Union is like the Central Asian, and I like there's definitely nuances there. Like I think as I mentioned like. Your sort of standard Muslim view of the Soviet Union, like in retrospect, is like generally negative, but like there's definitely room for a lot of nuance in there. Like I think that we pointed out some of those. But definitely like there are some serious missteps like in terms of that government and the Soviet support for it. I think, and I think that's something that I would
was it worth it? Was it worth it? The 9 years of bleeding out in the graveyard of empires, etc. Perhaps not, but of course, maybe it would have worked out if it wasn't for Bill Casey and his Operation Cyclone and the several $1 billion and hundreds of Stinger missiles. And Chinese like Soviet weapons and Egyptian bolt-action rifles and Saudi recruits.
That definitely was what turned the tide, was the bolt-action rifles that Mubarak
So I guess mission accomplished. Reagan administration, they got their victory after all.
Yeah.
I guess
they did get victory. Too bad they couldn't apply that to the the demon Karats today, and they failed to get victory.
No, they did. Yeah, they did not. They didn't conduct the
now we have to have
maximum
our own
pressure campaign.
Yeah, now we're living under communist rule ourselves. So the Soviets did win in the end because now we have Commandante Biden in the White House here with his first party secretary Kamala, who we all know is a very staunch Maoist.
Really staunch Maoist.
Like all Freemasons.
Yeah. Well, you have Biden the Stalinist, Kamala the Maoist, and Bernie the Trotskyist, and they're all perfectly in cahoots together with zero friction, like when I play my game.
Yeah.
Because that's how communism works. The ideology of sickos and domination and evil.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And apparently denying all the loci of power of the great Abrahamic religions, which need to crush it.
Yeah.
I guess to take the world over.
Yes.
Which is
yes,
the real Abraham Accords.
So the real Abraham Accords. I mean, that's a whole other interesting thing to consider. Is like these. I hope that like something. We'll see what happens in terms of Israel. Like it's really just like they need to stop. They need to be stopped. But these same ghouls in the GCC are rolling over. It seems like. Well, anyway, we could go on about that, but I just feel like, people are gonna have to. People are giving up. Maybe that's what has to happen. I don't know.
I don't know. It's
people
a
have
weird.
been demoralized.
it's a weird world we're living in, and this all this shit helped create it. And
yeah, definitely.
Now with our new president, I don't even think he's like really cognizant anymore of like how we got to where we are.
Yeah, well, yeah. We'll see. We'll see how this new administration shakes out. Certainly, I mean, like, I feel like it's going to be run by people who are, like, ideological students of Bill Casey, more or less.
Yes.
Like, that's who really will be making decisions in terms of where we go from here.
The tone,
Probably,
like, the tones and the virtues that are being signaled will be somewhat different, but, like, the underlying mentality and strategy is going to be very Bill Casey, I suspect.
Yeah.
You know, total, you know, like, you know, Maduro is like fat shaming, you know, Guaido's wife or something.
Yeah.
To bomb
Right.
him, you know, maximum pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll see. Like, it seems like it's gonna be like with an eye towards China. We'll see what happens. I mean, it might, like, by contrast, like, seem somewhat conciliatory, but I don't know. Like, he definitely has appointed some people who are kind of like Obama reformist China hawks. So we'll see what kind of goes down.
And thankfully, if there were, I mean, most of the people that were actually actors, like, in this book are probably dead now, but probably some of their proteges are kicking around. And judging by the, you know, the absolute purge we've had in this last month, where, you know, Republicans, like, finally came to their senses and got rid of this orange sicko fuck bad man, you know, and got him out.
The
now,
ultimate,
like, every,
who's a communist
like, probably
himself, you know, Maoist.
Basically,
Maoist,
if you're
because, you know,
if
hammer
you're
and
Putin's
sickle,
bitch,
Putin's
then
poodle, exactly.
Yeah.
And
if Putin's your daddy, you're a Marxist. So we'll see. But I think that it's like every ghoul or like weird like young Republican neocon who like sat at the feet of like Bill Casey and like Robert McFarlane in the 80s. Is coming from like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, is now like liberal approved for a job in like the new administration. So we might, you know what I mean? Like they've all got Lincoln projected. So even though that guy got canceled last week for like, I don't know, propositioning men or something like that, which is actually very Bill Casey of him, if you want to get real about it. I mean, we'll get, when we go back to Confessions of a DC Madam one day, that has a few great Bill Casey cameos involving like the escort blackmail rings and stuff.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know. You know, maybe we'll see who turns up in this new paradigm.
Yes, we certainly will. Yeah, and I mean, will we once again once again the U.S. is under Catholic control. You know, it was all like coordinated between, you know, Trump appointed them all to the Supreme Court. Trump and Obama worked together to cement the papist control over the Supreme Court, and now we have the
shit. You're right.
know,
and now we have a Jesuit-trained president. Oh my god! Yeah,
and the Jesuit Pope, and they're converging together.
Well, we're gonna have to. Okay, I think we're hitting that time now where I think like there's gonna be a Jesuit ep coming up in the next month or two. Yeah. Some Catholic deep dives. I think it's time. I think it's time. You know,
like, there's a lot
Busta
of,
tried to warn us.
Yes, he did try to warn us. Yeah, well, you know, this is all, as we've seen in this book, you know, it's all part of this massive subliminal / ecumenical crusade unfolding, and we got to stop the cats from coming out on top. You know.
I'm very
no
as somebody who is
our
programmed.
We love you.
I mean, I'm baptized in the I know. I was baptized in the Romanist faith.
I actually was also baptized.
as a papist.
That's a fun fact. about me is that like I'm claimed by like all three Abrahamic religions.
Wow, really? You're baptized as a Catholic?
Yeah, because my grandfather's Irish Catholic, so he insisted that I be baptized. Yeah.
Wow.
So I'm ontologically
okay. Well,
Christian.
now, okay. So you feel seen in the White House right now. I also have
because
a little.
Joe Biden is maybe
Yeah.
he's also an apostate Muslim, and prays with John Brennan. Maybe he was hitting his knees with Obama. Yeah.
That's oh my God. Yeah. No, we're it all converges at some point. But we'll figure it out once we have a little more to go off of with these Catholics in action. We'll let you all know, but few were as impactful as William J. Casey.
Yes, few were. Few had the honor of getting like a secret mass in a country where like Bibles weren't even allowed. Like,
that is mass off.
Yes. Yeah.
Word. Okay. Yeah. All right. I guess we'll get out of here now. Just everybody start playing Crisis of the Kremlin and start training, because one day you might be in charge of a workers' republic that is being attacked by a psychotic Knight of Malta who wants to starve you or make you scream uncle. So beware, and until next time, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows the fight was fixed. The poor stay poor and the rich get rich. That's how it goes. And everybody knows. Everybody knows the boat is leaking. Everybody knows the captain lied. Everybody got this broken feeling like their father or their dog just died. Everybody talking to their pockets. Everybody wants a box of chocolates and a long stem